On a winter night in Los Angeles, January 6, 1987, a homeless man, as he usually did, was wandering the streets of Koreatown, searching for a place to shelter from the cold. Unbeknownst to him, tonight would be the end of his life. A young man named Joseph Martin Danks, armed with a sharp knife like a skilled hunter, hid in the hazy night and quietly approached the homeless man. Without hesitation, he stabbed him in the heart with the knife, instantly taking his life. Next day, the sun rose as usual, and the streets were filled with people. The body of this poor man was discovered, his face bearing an expression of terror, as if it were telling the story of that horrifying night. In January 1987, a serial killer emerged near Koreatown in Los Angeles, who crazily targeted homeless people and carried out a series of brutal murders. He usually stabbed his victims from behind with great force, and his methods were extremely brutal. The first victim was 40-year-old Christopher Michael Forsblade. On January 7th, his body was found on Vermont Avenue. The crime scene was gruesome. The homeless man's body lay on the ground, his heart stabbed and blood pooling around him. 7 days later, 2 new victims appeared. Their remains were discovered at noon and in the afternoon respectively. One was 58-year-old Isaac Davis, killed on South Menlo Avenue. Then, in less than 3 hours, 55-year-old John Charles Coble was killed on West 9th Street. Autopsy reports showed that they died from stab wounds, with vital organs ruptured and bleeding to death. 2 days later, a homeless man, aged around 43 and whose identity was never confirmed, was brutally murdered on West 8th Street. The next day, 64-year-old Almond Lord was attacked on South Kenmore Avenue. The elderly man survived the assault because the multiple serial murders at the time had already heightened the vigilance of the local homeless population. He had been on guard, and when the assailant attacked him, he put up a fierce resistance, causing the attacker to flee. He also provided the police with a description of the suspect's appearance for a composite sketch during the subsequent investigation. On January 20th, 58-year-old James Lyons was attacked in Manhattan Plaza. Like Lord, he was prepared for an assault. Although he was stabbed, he also survived. A few hours later, another homeless man in his 50s was killed on Southwest Boulevard, and his identity was never confirmed. However, in this murder, a witness saw the assailant in the act. He chased the attacker for 5 blocks and then borrowed a phone from a passerby to call the police. The police responded swiftly, cornering the assailant in a dead-end alley. In the end, the attacker made no futile resistance. Just before being arrested, he wrapped the murder weapon, a kitchen knife, in a newspaper and threw it into a trash can, but it was eventually found by the police. After arriving at the police station, the killer's identity was confirmed as 25-year-old Joseph Martin Danks. He waived his Miranda rights, which means he had the right to remain silent and the right to have a lawyer present during questioning. He directly admitted to 6 counts of murder. In addition to his testimony, the main evidence proving Joseph's involvement in the murders was the kitchen knife he discarded, as the width and length of the blade matched the depth and shape of the victim's wounds. Furthermore, a 34-year-old man named Christopher John Regal was released by the police, as he had been the primary suspect in these murders before Joseph's arrest. According to Joseph's statement, his motive for the murders was personal animosity towards the homeless, whom he considered to be dirty and disgusting. And the start of his killing spree was triggered by a homeless man named Edwin Trujillo. He claimed that this homeless man caused the shelter to be overcrowded, preventing Joseph from being allowed to stay there overnight, although the police could not confirm whether this incident occurred. In March 1988, the prosecutor's office offered Joseph a plea deal, but he initially refused it. During the trial, Joseph was detained at the Men's Central Jail, where he exhibited symptoms of paranoia. He was keen on constructing conspiracy theories surrounding his detention, complaining that his prison food had been poisoned by unknown individuals. He firmly believed that the famous actor Burt Reynolds and television host Johnny Carson were in the same room with him, defecating in his food. He also accused the prison management of psychologically torturing him by playing music through the cameras in his cell. During a court hearing, Joseph even attacked his lawyer with a makeshift knife crafted from a toothbrush and a razor blade, causing minor injuries. In December of the same year, on the advice of his lawyer, Joseph accepted the plea deal in exchange for the withdrawal of the death penalty. According to the agreement, on December 23, 1988, he was found guilty of 6 murder charges and sentenced to life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole for 156 years. Due to his deteriorating mental health, Joseph was transferred to Atascadero State Hospital, where he received treatment from June 1989 to March 1990. During this period, after a psychiatric evaluation, Joseph was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder. He also underwent a neurological examination to determine if there were any suspected cysts in his brain, but the results did not reveal any abnormalities. After a period of treatment, his mental state improved, and on August 23, 1990, he was transferred out of the hospital to the California Correctional Institution in Tehachapi to continue serving his life sentence. Around 1 a.m. on September 21, 1990, Joseph was shouting loudly in his cell, claiming that he had killed his cellmate. A prison guard was alerted and went to check the cell, where he found the body of 67-year-old Walter Holt. That morning, during an interview about what had happened, Joseph stated that 3 hours after he was locked in the cell, Holt had fallen asleep, and he strangled Holt with a rope made from a bedsheet. He claimed that he killed the man because a divine voice had ordered him to do so. Obviously, this explanation was not credible to anyone, so Joseph was charged with first-degree murder. While awaiting trial, Joseph remained in prison, where he continued to engage in criminal activities. On November 12, 1991, a prison guard searched his cell and found a sharp plastic handle hidden in his mattress. On January 23, 1992, a prison guard conducted a strip search on several inmates, including Joseph. During the search, the guard forced the prisoners to take off their clothes. When he removed the handcuffs from Joseph and another inmate, Joseph used a piece of metal to stab the other prisoner in the head. On January 26th, another prison guard noticed smoke coming from Joseph's cell and immediately took him out to put out the fire. The cause of the fire was later determined to be Joseph setting his cell on fire with newspapers and magazines he had been collecting. On July 12th, during lunchtime, Joseph attacked a guard, beating him and attempting to splash a cup of hot coffee in his face. In early 1993, Joseph's trial for the murder of Holt began. During one of the court sessions, he attacked one of his lawyers, stabbing him with a sharp wire. On April 2, 1993, Joseph pleaded guilty to the murder charge and was subsequently sentenced to death. In his final statement, Joseph showed no remorse for his actions, claiming that he was doing God's work by killing the elderly man. He also threatened the judge and the prosecutor and told the jury members that he openly welcomed being executed. Joseph's mental condition was a cause for concern for everyone, but perhaps there was some explanation for it all. Joseph's story began on June 17, 1962, when he was born into a wealthy family in Bay City, Michigan. His mother was not his father's legal wife, but a nanny, and as a result, the innocent child was not highly regarded within the family. In fact, his birth was not valued by everyone. During her pregnancy, Joseph's mother continuously consumed alcohol, leading to his premature birth by 2 months. At birth, he weighed only 2 kilograms and had to spend 4 weeks in an incubator at the hospital. Even after returning home, he was not cared for by his parents, as the 2 irresponsible individuals continued to drink excessively after his birth. It was his half-sister and the hired housekeeper who took care of him. According to the housekeeper, on at least 2 occasions, he found Joseph crying and locked in a drawer by his mother. Additionally, there were reports of his parents giving him sedatives, causing him to be in a state of sleep for most of the time. Although his mother denied this, the couple's actions did not seem to convince people. In early 1964, his parents had a violent argument, during which his father beat his mother and broke her nose. This led to the angry mother leaving home with 2-year-old Joseph and living on her own. Over the next decade, Joseph endured a great deal of hardship. He witnessed his mother marrying a strange man, giving birth to 2 sons, and then constantly arguing with his stepfather, which led to the stepfather leaving home and abandoning the family. He also saw his mother being consoled by another man, and under the meticulous care of this man, she married him. In 1976, Joseph returned to Bay City with his mother and new stepfather, and then Joseph reconnected with his biological father and 2 half-brothers. At this point, they were already deeply in debt, having lost their house and jobs, and were living in a trailer, surviving by theft while using various anesthetics such as marijuana, LSD, and phencyclidine. A year later, 15-year-old Joseph was involved in 2 traffic accidents within just a few months, one of which resulted in a head injury. Although he successfully recovered after being discharged from the hospital, he showed signs of mental illness, which was not surprising. In fact, his half-brother also suffered from schizophrenia, as their biological father was both a drug user and an alcoholic, with declining memory. A year later, Joseph was arrested in Mexico on suspicion of drug possession. Although he was ultimately only fined administratively, his new stepfather directly prohibited him from entering the trailer and contacting his biological father and brothers, a wise decision because soon after his 2 half-brothers were arrested for drug trafficking. In the following year, Joseph dropped out of school and ran away from home. He began a months-long journey of homelessness, constantly hitchhiking between various cities. During this period, Joseph's mental state deteriorated rapidly, with symptoms of hypochondria and clinical delirium. He frequently moved furniture around the house and deliberately cut the electrical wires, claiming that someone was watching him through the television. He also accused his mother and other relatives of trying to poison him, so he refused to eat any food prepared by his family. He seemed to have a severe case of mysophobia, obsession with cleanliness, washing dishes, and tidying the room multiple times a day. In addition, he was plagued by auditory hallucinations, as he claimed to be communicating with his deceased grandparents. Even though his family wanted to help him, he refused any medical assistance, insisting that drug addiction was a common phenomenon in society. He was also convinced that President Ronald Reagan smoked 10,000 marijuana cigarettes a day. Due to unemployment, he relied on financial support from his mother, but he suspected that his mother and aunt were colluding to print counterfeit money and threatened to report them to the police. In his spare time, he hung out with local homeless people, and over time, he gradually stopped taking care of his appearance, becoming slovenly and unhygienic. In October 1982, Joseph appeared at an elementary school in New Jersey, dressed in tattered clothes, causing a panic. He was forcibly taken to the police station. After returning to Michigan, he again complained of experiencing hallucinations. Having committed several minor offenses, Joseph was involuntarily committed to a mental hospital for treatment. Although he managed to escape after 2 weeks, he was found in Florida after several days on the run and was sent back to the facility, where he received treatment until early 1984. He was then sent back to his mother. At this point, Joseph's first stepfather offered him a job, attempting to repair their relationship. However, starting in 1985, Joseph's mental state deteriorated again. He displayed misanthropic traits, refusing to accompany his stepfather to any fast food restaurants or other public places. And he demanded that food be delivered to him by truck and claimed that an unidentified malicious entity was tracking him. After a while, he left his stepfather and once again began hitchhiking across the country. In 1986, Joseph went to live with one of his half-brothers for several weeks. However, this brother had become a Jehovah's Witness after being released from prison 2 years prior, had gotten married, and had ceased all criminal activities, leading to arguments between the two, and Joseph eventually left. In June 1986, Joseph was arrested for illegally possessing a sawed-off shotgun. During his incarceration in the county jail, he exhibited signs of obsessive-compulsive disorder, constantly keeping his cell clean and washing his belongings multiple times a day. In September, Joseph pleaded guilty to an attempted theft charge and was sentenced to 5 years of probation. After his release, he left Michigan again and reappeared in Los Angeles, California by the end of 1986, marking the beginning of Joseph's murder spree. On April 2, 1993, after the final sentencing, Joseph was transferred to a death row cell at San Quentin State Prison. As time went on, his mental health continued to deteriorate. He often complained of hallucinations and pain caused by rats, but no traces of rats were found in his cell. Joseph also suffered from insomnia, frequently screaming at night and waking other prisoners from their sleep. He also often attacked prison guards, once pouring urine on a guard. Although his mental illness was known, he did not receive treatment until 2011. In 2004, Joseph's lawyer drafted an appeal, asking to overturn his death sentence and requesting a retrial. This was because during the second trial in 1993, 2 jurors sought advice from their parish clergy, a violation of the rules that juries should follow, as jurors are prohibited from discussing the case outside the courtroom. However, the appeal was rejected. In 2012, Joseph's family hired a lawyer to appeal his death sentence, asking for treatment for his mental disorder. However, the court did not make a final decision on this appeal. On March 13, 2019, the governor of California ordered a suspension of the death penalty in the state. This meant that although Joseph's death sentence remained valid due to the governor's order, he would not be executed. And his case and health continued to be monitored, especially since he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder. On a chilly winter night at the end of the 20th century, a young soldier in military uniform stood by a California highway, trying to hitch a ride. As time passed, an old car slowly approached. The driver was Randy Stephen Kraft, who sat behind the wheel with an imperceptible smile on the corner of his mouth. His gaze through the windshield was fixed on the young soldier, waving his hand incessantly. He knew that tonight he had found his prey. After the car slowly pulled over and stopped, the soldier got into the vehicle. Unbeknownst to him, he had stepped into a hell from which there was no turning back. Initially, the atmosphere inside the car was relatively calm, with the two occasionally chatting about various topics. Until, after he drank the alcohol handed to him by Randy, everything turned strange. Sensing the changes in his body, the soldier realized something was amiss. His voice trembled as he tried to say something, but before he could utter a word, his body became heavy and his consciousness gradually blurred. He attempted to struggle, but it was too late, as Randy's hands had already tightly clasped around his neck. When night fell again, another silent specter haunted that highway, yet the Freeway Killer's murders were still going on. This story began on March 19, 1945, when Randy was born in Long Beach, California. His family led a simple life. His father worked at an aircraft factory, and due to the great financial pressure, his mother also took on several part-time jobs to help support the family. Although he did not have much parental companionship, Randy was doted on by his 3 older sisters, even though he was just a tag-along little brother. In 1948, they moved to Orange County. Their house was originally a small wooden building designated for female Army soldiers, which was later converted into a 3-bedroom house. It was here that Randy attended the local elementary school. In order to help him integrate and to offer her assistance, his mother joined the Parent-Teacher Association and became a member of it. During his adolescence, Randy developed a strong interest in politics. He became a staunch Republican, aspiring to be a U.S. Senator. Shortly after entering Westminster High School, Randy was regarded by those around him as a pleasant and intelligent student who often achieved A-level grades. Occasionally, he would go on dates with girls, but some classmates and teachers at that time suspected that Randy was homosexual. Later, Randy said that he had known he was gay since high school, but initially kept his sexual orientation a secret. On June 13, 1963, Randy graduated. That fall, he entered Claremont Men's College in Claremont, California. Shortly after enrollment, Randy joined the Reserve Officers Training Corps and regularly attended demonstrations in support of the Vietnam War. He also participated in the campaign rally for Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater in 1964. He later claimed that these actions were just an imitation of his parents' political views, rather than his own. In the same year, Randy began his first known homosexual relationship. He worked as a bartender at a Garden Grove cocktail lounge that catered to gay clients. He also frequently went to Laguna Beach and Huntington Beach to have casual sex with some men. During those days, Randy tried to reveal his sexual orientation to his parents. He often brought a series of male friends to meet his family. However, Randy's parents and sisters turned a blind eye to his homosexual identity. In 1966, Randy solicited a prostitute in Huntington Beach, who turned out to be an undercover police officer. He was arrested and charged with lewd conduct. However, since he had no prior criminal record, no charges were filed. The following year, Randy's political beliefs underwent a fundamental shift. He became a supporter of liberal views and registered as a Democrat. Soon after, he became an organizer for the Democratic Party, tirelessly campaigning for Robert Kennedy's election and even receiving a personal letter from the senator thanking him for his efforts. By his senior year, Randy had become a lackadaisical student. He indulged in alcohol and drugs and often gambled and played poker with other students all night long. Due to his lack of study in his final year, Randy failed to graduate from Claremont College in June 1967. He was forced to retake a course in econometrics, which delayed his graduation by 8 months. It was not until February 1968 that Randy finally graduated from Claremont Men's College with a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics. 4 months after graduation, Randy joined the U.S. Air Force. He was sent to Texas for basic training and then stationed at Edwards Air Force Base in Southern California. His job was to supervise the painting of test aircraft. During his service, Randy was promoted to the rank of first pilot. In the same year, he came out as gay to his family. In a letter to a friend, he described his father's furious reaction. Although his mother was more understanding, she still seemed somewhat disapproving. Eventually, Randy's family accepted his sexual orientation. He believed that he still maintained close contact with his parents and 3 sisters, but his siblings pointed out that after he revealed his sexual orientation to them, he began to distance himself from his family. Randy also disclosed his sexual orientation to his superiors, and then he was discharged after only 13 months of service. His discharge was officially listed as being for medical reasons. In response, he sought legal advice from a lawyer to question the reasons for his discharge, but to no avail. After being discharged from the military, Randy moved back to his parents' home and found a job as a bartender. In March 1970, Randy met a 13-year-old boy named Joseph Alwyn Fancher in Huntington Beach. The boy told Randy that he had run away from home and had nowhere to live, so Randy invited the young man to his apartment. He promised Fancher that he could live with him and even offered to arrange sexual encounters with a woman he claimed to know. Fancher agreed and accompanied Randy to his apartment in Belmont Shore. There, Fancher was drugged, beaten, and sexually assaulted multiple times. Several hours later, after Randy left for work, Fancher managed to flee the apartment. A passerby, shocked by his drugged and disheveled state, called an ambulance. At the hospital, Fancher told the police that Randy had drugged and beaten him. Due to shame and fear that no one would believe him, he did not disclose to his parents or the police that he had been sexually assaulted. With the cooperation of Randy's roommate, the police searched the apartment. However, since Fancher confessed to the police that he had voluntarily taken the pills offered to him and the police had conducted the search without a warrant, no charges were filed against Randy. In 1971, Randy met Jeff Graves, a student from Minnesota who was 4 years his junior, and began a relationship with him. During the period from 1971 to 1983, Randy was suspected of murdering as many as 67 people, almost all of whom were men aged around 13 to 35. The majority of the victims were members of the Marine Corps. This was because Randy was a homosexual, and his motives for committing these crimes were closely related to sexual abuse and sexual gratification, so he tended to target young, physically strong males. The reason why Randy was able to successfully murder some men who were stronger than him was that he never engaged in direct confrontation with them. He usually first used alcohol or other drugs to leave the victims completely defenseless. According to forensic identification, the remains of most of the victims contained high concentrations of alcohol and sedatives, which meant that they had lost consciousness long before they were abused and killed. His modus operandi was typically to look for young, strong hitchhikers on the highway, then offer them alcohol or water laced with sedatives. When they fell into a deep sleep, he would tie them up and then torture and sexually abuse them, burning their chests, faces, and genitals with fire. His final method of execution was also extremely horrific. He would castrate, strangle, or dismember them. And finally, he would dump their remains beside the highway or take them back to his home. On October 5, 1971, the naked body of a 30-year-old man named Wayne Joseph Duquette was found near Ortega Highway. He was a bartender at the Stable, a gay bar in nearby Sunset Beach. He was last seen on September 20th. Because his body was completely decomposed, the forensic doctor could not detect any signs of injury. So initially, his cause of death was listed as acute alcohol poisoning due to high blood alcohol content. However, in Randy's diary, the word stable was written. So investigators believe that Wayne was his first victim. 15 months later, a 20-year-old Marine named Edward Daniel Moore was murdered. He was last seen leaving the military camp on December 24, 1972. In the early morning of 2 days later, his body was found beside the highway. The autopsy showed that his wrists and ankles had been tied up, and then his face had been struck by the murderer with a blunt object. There were also large areas of abrasions on his body, which meant that he had been pushed out of a moving vehicle. This was strange, as it suggested that there was another accomplice at the crime scene. However, to this day, the other accomplice has not been identified, and this has also been the source of much debate. On April 14th, the body of 17-year-old Kevin Clark Bailey was found beside a road in Huntington Beach. Before his death, he had been castrated and anally raped. On July 28th, 2 victims were murdered. An unidentified young man, whose dismembered body was found in Wilmington on April 22nd, and a 20-year-old man named Ronnie Jean Vibe, whose strangled body was dumped beside the ramp of the 405 freeway on July 30th, 2 days after he went missing. A 23-year-old bisexual art student named Vincent Cruz Mestas. On December 29th, his body was found in the San Bernardino Mountains. Like the previous several victims, the murderer's methods were extremely brutal, and Mestas' missing hands have still not been found to this day. In November 1974, police found 5 more victims beside major roads in Southern California, 3 of whom were confirmed to be related to the same murderer, as their causes of death were almost identical. 20-year-old Malcolm Eugene Little and 19-year-old James Dale Reeves had foreign objects inserted into their remains, and the body of 18-year-old Marine Roger Edward Dickerson had bite marks, which were very similar to those of the previous several victims. On January 3, 1975, a 17-year-old high school student named John William Laris was murdered. He was last seen boarding a bus in Long Beach. The day after his disappearance, his body was found dumped in Sunset Beach. The cause of his death was strangulation, and foreign objects had been forcibly inserted into his body. There were clear drag marks at the initial discovery site of the corpse, indicating that the perpetrator was not alone but accompanied by another person. 2 weeks after this murder, on January 17th, the body of a 21-year-old man named Craig Jeannetis was found discarded in a parking lot, and the cause of death was also strangulation. By January 1975, a total of 14 victims were suspected by the police to be connected to the same killer. Their remains had been discovered discarded in 4 different counties over the past 3 years. All the victims were white males with similar physical characteristics. On January 24th, homicide investigators from multiple jurisdictions in Southern California gathered in Orange County to discuss the progress of their manhunt for the unidentified killer. The FBI presented a profile of the murderer to the investigators, describing him as a methodical and organized lust killer with above-average intelligence who showed indifference to the interests and welfare of society. Some investigators also believed that the murders were not the work of a single individual but involved one or more people with a military background. This was because residue of tissues was found in the nostrils of 2 victims, a procedure commonly used by the military to prevent post-mortem washing of remains. At this point, the investigators still did not have any concrete suspects. On the evening of March 29th, 2 young men, Keith Crotwell and Kent May, got into a stranger's Ford Mustang in a Long Beach parking lot. They drove around aimlessly in the Belmont Shore and Seal Beach areas, with the driver even giving them beer. May later recalled that he felt very nervous when he noticed his body becoming rigid after consuming alcohol. When the car pulled into a parking lot, the driver leaned over, opened the passenger door, pushed the unconscious May onto the ground, and then sped away from the scene. People present noticed Crotwell sitting in the passenger seat, his head resting against the driver. On May 8th, Crotwell's skull was found on a pier near the Long Beach Pier, and the rest of his body was discovered 6 months later. Upon hearing of Crotwell's death, May and 2 of Crotwell's friends were shocked. They immediately suspected that the driver from that time was the killer, a patron who frequently visited a gay bar in Belmont Shore. They searched the nearby community for the Ford Mustang and found the vehicle within a 1-mile radius, noting down its license plate number and passing the information on to the police. After an investigation, the authorities identified Randy as a suspect, as the car was registered in his name. On May 19th, the police called Randy to question him about Crotwell's kidnapping and murder. Initially, Randy denied having ever seen Crotwell and May, which puzzled the police, as witnesses had already confirmed the encounter and the vehicle had been located. Consequently, they summoned Randy to the police station for further interrogation. Once in the interrogation room, Randy admitted that around March 29th, he had met the 2 young men in a Long Beach parking lot and persuaded them to drink alcohol and take sedatives while driving. He then dropped May off at the parking lot but continued to wander around with Crotwell. They subsequently drove down a side road, but the car broke down, so he parked it on the side of the road. Crotwell chose to stay in the car while he walked to a gas station to call for a tow truck. When he returned, Crotwell had vanished. Randy's roommate corroborated his account, as Randy had called him that day to say his car was stranded on the side of the road. However, the investigators still did not believe Randy's story. In the following week, 2 detectives attempted to file murder charges against Randy, but the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office refused, citing the coroner's conclusion from the autopsy of the remains found so far that Crotwell had died of accidental drowning. On December 31st, a 22-year-old boy named Mark Hall was kidnapped in San Juan Capistrano. His death was the most agonizing among all the victims. His body was tied to a tree, and he suffered from being anally raped and castrated. In addition, his chest, scrotum, nose, eyes, and cheeks were burned, and there were many wounds on his legs caused by broken bottles. Most importantly, the forensic doctor was able to determine that he was still alive for most of the time he was being tortured. In 1976, Randy ended his relationship with Graves. Shortly after, he began a relationship with a 19-year-old bakery apprentice named Jeff Seelig, and then they moved to Laguna Hills. Although neither of them was inclined towards monogamy, they considered their relationship to be permanent. Seelig later told investigators that he and Randy would often ask hitchhikers for sex, and if they were willing, they would go back to their apartment with Seelig and Randy. On December 10, 1976, 19-year-old Paul Joseph Fuchs went missing. His body was never found, but his name was clearly recorded in Randy's diary. He was last seen outside a gay bar called Ripples in Long Beach, where Randy was a regular customer. On January 3, 1978, investigators held another meeting. They believed that there was more than one killer, but the identity of the perpetrator still could not be confirmed. July of the previous year was an important turning point. Fortunately, Patrick Kearney was arrested, and he confessed to the murders of 28 boys and young men, many of whom were dissected and discarded in garbage bags beside highways in Southern California. Unfortunately, Although Patrick was arrested, his method of murder was completely different from that of some other victims, which meant that the perpetrator that the investigators were still pursuing remained at large. On April 16th, an 18-year-old Marine named Scott Michael Hughes was kidnapped. His body contained a large amount of sedatives, and the cause of his death was manual strangulation. Since a shoelace was missing from his shoes, investigators suspected that he was strangled with a shoelace. In addition to him, 5 other victims were murdered in the same way that year. On June 16, 1979, a new victim was found again. A 20-year-old Marine named Donnie Harold Kreisel was thrown onto the highway from a moving vehicle. His death was listed as acute alcohol poisoning, although he had very severe burns and signs of being tied up and tortured. On August 29th, the dismembered body of a 21-year-old British tourist named Keith Anthony Jackson was found in 2 garbage bags and a cardboard box behind a Union 76 gas station in Long Beach. 2 weeks later, the body of 19-year-old Gregory Wallace Jolly was discovered, with his head, legs, and genitals severed. On November 24th, a 15-year-old boy named Jeffrey Sayre from Santa Ana was kidnapped and murdered. He was last seen at a bus stop in Westminster after returning home from a date with his girlfriend. On February 18, 1980, the decapitated body of a 19-year-old Marine named Mark Allan Marsh was found near the Temescal Highway. He was last seen hitchhiking to Buena Park. In the summer of 1980, Randy went on a long business trip to Oregon. During this trip, he stayed in a small town near Portland. Before he returned to California, several victims were found in the area. The first victim was a 17-year-old Denver youth named Michael Sean O'Fallon, who had been hitchhiking alone across the United States and Canada. On July 17th, he was murdered, and his body was dumped 10 miles south of Salem. His body contained high concentrations of alcohol and sedatives. On September 3rd, the body of 19-year-old Marine Robert Loggins, who was tied up, was found in a garbage bag near the El Toro Marine Corps Air Station. He was last seen near the Pacific Coast Highway on August 23rd. Photos and negatives found by investigators showed Loggins in Randy's living room, sitting on the sofa in neat clothes, looking drunk, and his body was posed in various nude erotic positions in the photos. On April 10, 1981, a 17-year-old youth named Michael Crook was kidnapped while hitchhiking from Kent, Washington to Bakersfield, California. His body was found beside Interstate 5 near Goshen, Oregon. The autopsy report showed that his head had suffered 31 blunt force strikes, and after death, his body was subjected to anal rape and severe beating. At the time of this murder, Randy was sent to Oregon by his employer, and coincidentally, Randy was receiving treatment for a foot contusion at a nearby hospital on the day the body was found. 4 months later, the body of 17-year-old sex worker Christopher Allen Williams, who was dressed in tattered clothes, was found in the San Bernardino Mountains. His body contained phenobarbital and benzodiazepines, and when found, tissues were deep in his nostrils. The cause of death was suffocation by his own mucus. On July 29th, after residents of Echo Park complained about a foul smell coming from the direction of the Hollywood Freeway, an employee found the decomposing body of 14-year-old Raymond Davis from Pittsburgh, California, dumped beside the ramp. His body was hidden under leaves and soil. He was last seen in Echo Park on June 17th, looking for his missing dog. The young man's wrists were tied behind his back, almost the same as the way the victims died 2 years ago. Just 40 feet away from his body, the same employee also found the body of 16-year-old Robert Avila, who had been missing since July 21st, and his body also showed obvious signs of decomposition. On November 1st, 24-year-old Arne Mikkel Lane from Modesto went missing. He was hitchhiking to Orange County to look for a job, and his body was not found until 2 years later. On December 3rd, a 29-year-old man named Anthony Jose Severa went missing while hitchhiking to Medford. His body was found 2 weeks later. Before the murder, he was strangled, anally raped, and violated with foreign objects. At that time, Randy was on a business trip in Oregon and happened to end his trip on the same day Silvera died. On December 4th, Randy drove from Portland to Seattle to visit friends, and someone happened to see him wearing a military jacket with Silvera's name on it. The next day, Randy left Seattle and flew to Michigan. 2 days later, Randy met Dennis Alt and Christopher Schoenborn at a seminar in the Amway Grand Plaza Hotel. At midnight, someone also saw Randy talking with the couple in the hotel's reception area. A few days later, their remains were found in an open area near the hotel. Both victims were given alcohol and sedatives before being anally raped and murdered. and they were arranged in sexually suggestive poses. 24-year-old Alt died of suffocation, and 20-year-old Schoenborn was strangled with a belt. The day before these two victims were found, on December 8th, Randy traveled from Michigan to Portland. Within 24 hours of his return to Oregon, a 19-year-old hitchhiker named Lance Taggs was killed. Lance was last seen hitchhiking from Tigard to a relative's home in Los Angeles on the same day, and his body was found the next day, dumped on a rural road in Clackamas County. At this point, investigators noticed that in the murders that occurred in Oregon, when the remains of young men were found dumped near public transportation, their blood contained alcohol and drugs. They speculated that the murderer lived in another state, so the Oregon investigators relayed the details of the murders to police in other states, described the modus operandi of the killer they were looking for, and asked police departments with unsolved young male murder cases with similar characteristics in their files to provide feedback. The counties in Southern California responded quickly because they found that the killing pattern of this unidentified murderer was the same as the one they were pursuing, so they determined that these murders were all committed by the same killer. On January 27, 1983, a 21-year-old hitchhiker named Eric Church was kidnapped and murdered. He was last seen hitchhiking from Orange County to Sacramento the day before he was murdered. The autopsy concluded that he had consumed a large amount of alcohol and sedatives, and he was anally raped. The rope marks on his wrists indicated that he had resisted before his death. He died of ligature strangulation and multiple blunt force strikes to the side of the skull. On February 12th, 18-year-old Jeffrey Allan Nelson and 20-year-old Roger James DeVoe were murdered. The two young men were last seen outside a friend named Bryce Wilson's house shortly after midnight, when they told Wilson they were going to buy something to eat. Nelson's body was found beside a ramp near the Garden Grove Freeway just a few hours after he and Roger were last seen. The next day, Roger's body was found, dumped on a hillside near Baldy Mountain in San Bernardino County. At 1:10 a.m. on May 14th, two California Highway Patrol officers observed a Toyota making an illegal lane change on an interstate highway in Orange County. Suspecting the driver of driving under the influence, they signaled for the vehicle to stop. The driver then slowed down, parked the car, and exited the vehicle, discarding a beer bottle on the sidewalk. The officers administered a field sobriety test, which the driver failed, leading to Randy's arrest for driving while intoxicated. Meanwhile, another officer approached the vehicle and noticed a young man slumped in the passenger seat with his eyes closed. Several empty muscled head beer bottles and an opened bottle of lorazepam tablets were scattered around his feet. The officer attempted to wake the man but received no response. When he tried to rouse him by shaking his arm, he noticed the man's low body temperature. As he prepared to check for a pulse, he observed that the man was already dead, with clear ligature marks on his neck. The man's jeans were unzipped, exposing his genitals, and his hands were bound with a shoelace, bearing wrist injuries. He was later identified as 25-year-old Marine Corps Air Station El Toro-based Marine Terry Lee Gambrill, who had been strangled. Randy was then arrested. He was initially charged with driving under the influence, with further charges pending the investigators' subsequent inquiries. In the car's back seat, investigators discovered a belt, as well as alcohol, sedatives, various prescription drugs, and stimulants. There were also significant blood stains on the car's leather seats and carpeting. Under the carpet, they found an envelope containing more than 50 photographs of young men in pornographic poses, either asleep or deceased. In the trunk, they also found a diary with a list of 61 coded symbols. Subsequently, investigators conducted a further search of Randy's home, where they found clothing and personal items belonging to many of the young men murdered over the past decade. They also deciphered the symbols, which were believed to refer to each of Randy's victims, such as the initials of their names or the locations where the victims were last seen. On May 16th, Randy was formally charged with murder. In September, investigators interviewed over 700 witnesses and collected more than 250 pieces of physical evidence, which implicated him in 15 additional homicides committed between December 1972 and February 1983. On September 8th, Randy was formally charged with 15 counts of murder, as well as 2 counts of sodomy and 1 count of castration. On September 26, 1988, Randy's trial began in Orange County, where he was prosecuted by the judge. During the trial, nearly 160 witnesses were called to testify on behalf of the prosecution, and over 1,000 pieces of evidence were introduced. These included physical evidence such as blood stains, hair, and fiber evidence found in Randy's Long Beach residence and his vehicle, fingerprints discovered on glass shards at the crime scenes, and photographs and negatives of the victims found in Randy's car. Other evidence presented included work and travel records, as well as gas receipts that placed Randy at specific locations where the victims were kidnapped or discarded, along with a large number of personal items belonging to the various murder victims. Randy's defense primarily consisted of extraneous statements and alternative suspects. His attorneys argued that most of the evidence was circumstantial and attempted to portray Randy as an articulate, diligent, and upright member of the community. They did not deny that the 16 individuals were victims, but claimed that they were victims of someone else, not Randy. The defense also pointed out that investigators initially believed several of the 16 victims were killed by 2 other serial killers and argued that there was no concrete evidence proving Randy had killed any of the victims. The trial lasted a total of 13 months. On April 29, 1989, the closing arguments began, which lasted for 3 days. The prosecution again listed all the physical evidence and circumstantial evidence pointing to Randy's guilt. The defense argued about the circumstantial case presented by the prosecution, namely that all the murders were connected, and accused the prosecution of covering up the truth. Then the jury deliberated for 11 days before reaching a verdict. On May 12th, Randy was convicted of 16 counts of murder, 1 count of sodomy, and 1 count of castration. On June 5th, the same jury reconvened for the penalty phase of the trial, where they needed to hear further testimony from both the prosecution and the defense regarding Randy's punishment. This phase of the trial lasted until August. It was during this time that the prosecution presented evidence of several additional murders committed by Randy in Oregon and Michigan, and they were convinced that Randy was also responsible for these crimes. The defense refuted the prosecution's claims, calling them highly speculative and not based on reality. They also introduced testimony related to a PET scan conducted on Randy, claiming that the scan showed abnormalities in his frontal lobe, which reduced his ability to control his emotions and impulses. The prosecution dismissed this testimony, telling the jury that there was nothing wrong with Randy's mind. He simply enjoyed killing for sexual gratification. They added that the fact that his family and friends found it hard to believe he had committed any murders only showed what a good salesman he was. On August 11th, the jury handed down a death sentence. 3 months later, on November 29th, the judge formally sentenced Randy to death, saying, "To have something like this take place in our society, I think I've sent 8 or 9 individuals to their death in my courtroom before. I can take all those aggravating circumstances in those other cases and they don't match Mr. Kraft's record. I just can't comment. If anyone ever deserved the death penalty, he's got it coming." On August 9, 2000, the California Supreme Court upheld the original verdict. As of 2025, Randy remains in the death row cell at San Quentin State Prison, and he continues to deny responsibility for any of the murders he was convicted of or suspected of committing. At the end of the 20th century, on a pitch-black night in an unremarkable house in Houston, Texas, a chilling and heinous bloody murder was quietly brewing. Dean Arnold Quarles was about to carry out evil atrocities on 2 teenagers he had lured to his home. This man, known as the Candyman by the community residents because he often gave out free candy to children, had won people's trust in this way. On this terrible night, there was also the presence of another victim, a boy named Elmer Wayne Henley, who was one of Quarles' criminal accomplices. Although this teenager had already been involved in multiple criminal activities with Quarles, this time he felt sympathy and pity for one of the victims, and as a result, he was also tied up. However, through a series of pleas and promises, Henley was untied, but on the condition that he had to participate in the torture and murder of the victims. As the killing was about to begin, at this decisive moment, a surge of defiance rose from deep within Henley's heart. He couldn't bear to watch more innocent teenagers get hurt, so he seized Quarles' pistol and fired several shots at the devil without hesitation. On December 24, 1939, Quarles was born into an ordinary family from Fort Wayne, Indiana. His home was filled with frequent arguments because his father and mother had completely different ideas about raising children. The father was very strict with the kids, while the mother obviously favored and protected them. It's easy to imagine that growing up in such a family, the children would feel confused and contradictory. So, Quarles' mother decided to divorce. She wanted to get the children away from this environment, so she sold the house and moved to Memphis, Tennessee with young Quarles and his brother living in a trailer. Perhaps Quarles' mother still believed in that man, and she didn't want the 2 children to lack fatherly love. Not long after the divorce, she remarried Quarles' father and moved together to Pasadena, a suburb of Houston, Texas. However, this marriage didn't last long either. A few years later, the couple divorced again, and the mother still obtained custody of the 2 sons. Despite this, the two boys still maintained regular contact with their father. The discord between their parents led to Coral being introverted and serious from a young age, rarely interacting with other children. But he had a tender heart and was extremely sensitive to any form of criticism or rejection. This is also the reason why some unhappy families choose not to separate, because children really need a childhood filled with parental love. In 1953, after Coral's parents divorced for the second time, his mother married a traveling clock salesman, and then the family moved to the small town of Victoria, Texas. His half-sister was also born. Here, Coral's mother and his stepfather started a small family candy company, which was initially operated out of the garage. Coral went to school while participating in the company's daily operations. He and his brother were in charge of operating the candy-making machines and packaging the products. Their stepfather was responsible for sales, often going to Houston to sell most of the products. From 1954 to 1958, Coral attended Victoria High School. At school, he was regarded as a well-behaved student with satisfactory grades. Although he was still a bit introverted, according to his classmates' memories, he occasionally went on dates with girls. In the summer of 1958, Coral graduated from high school. Shortly after, he and his family moved to the northern suburbs of Houston because it was closer to the main market for their candy business. They also opened a store called Pecan Prince at their new home, a name derived from the brand of their family products. In 1960, Coral moved to Yoder, Indiana, to live with his grandmother. There, he established a close relationship with a local girl, but for some unknown reason, he turned down her marriage proposal. After living in Indiana for nearly 2 years, in 1962, he returned to Houston to continue helping with the family's candy business. In 1963, Coral's mother divorced his stepfather, and then they set up a new candy company named Coral Candy Company. Coral was appointed vice president of the new family business, while his brother was appointed secretary and treasurer. That same year, a teenage male employee complained to Coral's mother, alleging that Coral had made sexual advances towards him. To prevent the spread of gossip, she fired the teenage. On August 10, 1964, Coral was drafted into the U.S. Army. He was assigned to Fort Polk, Louisiana, for basic training, and then sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, for radio repairman training. Eventually, he was stationed at Fort Hood, Texas. According to official military records, Coral's service in the Army was unblemished. However, he did not enjoy military service and applied for early discharge, citing the need for his family business. The Army approved his request, and after serving for 10 months, he was discharged on June 11, 1965. Because the Coral Candy Company, created by his mother, and Pecan Prince, his former stepfather's business, had been in constant competition, Coral immediately threw himself into the candy business upon his return, facing the growing public demand for his family's products. In fact, it was during his military service that Coral first realized he was homosexual, and he also experienced his first homosexual encounter there. After returning to Houston, Coral's behavior changed subtly. He often spent time with teenage boys. That same year, Coral Candy Company moved across the street from Helms Elementary School. Coral became known for giving out free candy to local children, especially teenage boys, a practice that earned him the nicknames the Candyman and the Pied Piper. He also installed a pool table behind the candy factory, where employees and local young people would gather. It was noted that he frequently flirted with several teenage male employees there. In 1967, Coral met 12-year-old David Owen Brooks, a 6th grade student and one of the many children he gave candy to for free. Brooks often interacted with Coral and the various teenage boys who gathered behind the candy factory, and he regularly went on trips to the beaches of South Texas with different young people. Later, Brooks said that he was drawn to Coral because he was the first adult male who didn't mock his appearance, and Coral would give him money whenever he needed cash. Brooks also had a very poor family environment, with his parents frequently arguing. Coincidentally, during this period, Coral treated him like the father he had imagined, and as a result, Brooks developed unusual feelings for Coral. Starting in 1969, the two gradually developed a sexual relationship. In 1968, after the failure of Coral's mother's third marriage, she and his half-sister closed down Coral Candy Company and moved together to Colorado. Although his mother often talked to Coral on the phone, the two never met again. At this time, Coral, having received training as a radio repairman in the Army, found a job as an electrician in Houston. On September 25, 1970, an 18-year-old college freshman named Jeffrey Connon disappeared while hitchhiking with another University of Texas student to his parents' home in Houston. 3 years later, on August 10, 1973, His naked body was found under a boulder in Mustang Island Beach. According to the medical examiner's speculation, Conan died of human strangulation and asphyxiation caused by a rag gag in his mouth. At the scene of the burial, Conan's hands and feet were tightly bound with nylon rope. Shortly after Conan's disappearance on December 13th, Brooks lured two 14-year-old boys, James Glass and Danny Yates, away from a religious gathering in Houston Heights to Coral's apartment in Yorktown. The two young men were tied to Coral's torture board, and Coral intended to sexually assault them. Initially, Brooks discovered and stopped him. Then Coral promised to give Brooks a car in exchange for his silence. Brooks agreed, and the two young men were subsequently sexually assaulted, strangled, and buried in a boat shed rented by Coral on November 17th. Brooks received a green Chevrolet Corvette, and then Coral threatened Brooks, saying that since he had killed the two young men, Brooks had become his accomplice in murder, and if anyone told the police, he would also be arrested. However, Coral then made another offer to Brooks, saying he would pay him some money, but the condition was that Brooks had to continuously lure other boys to his apartment. On January 30th, 1971, Brooks and Coral encountered two young boys, Donald and Jerry Waldrop. Initially, they were driven by their father to a friend's house to plan the formation of a bowling league. After finding out their friend was not home, they began walking back. However, the story ended with the two young men being lured into Coral's van and taken to the apartment he was renting, where they were raped and strangled. Between March and May of the same year, Coral kidnapped and murdered 3 victims living in Houston Heights, burying their remains behind the boat shed. Brooks was involved in each kidnapping. One of the victims was 15-year-old Randall Harvey, last seen by his family on the afternoon of March 9th as he rode his bicycle to Oak Forest, where he worked part-time as a gas station attendant. Harvey was taken to Coral's apartment and shot in the head, killing him. The other 2 victims, 13-year-old David Hilligius and 16-year-old Gregory Malley Winkle, were kidnapped and killed together on the afternoon of May 29th. After learning of their sons' disappearances, Winkle's mother and David's parents frantically searched for the boys, even printing reward posters offering money to anyone who provided information on the boys' whereabouts. One of Coral's criminal accomplices, 15-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley, initially volunteered to distribute these posters, trying to reassure the distraught parents that the boys' disappearance might have another explanation rather than them truly being missing. On August 17th, Coral and Brooks met Brooks' 17-year-old acquaintance Reuben Watson Haney while returning home from a movie theater in Houston. Brooks persuaded Haney to attend a housewarming party at Coral's new residence on San Felipe Street, which he had moved to the previous month. Haney agreed, was taken to Coral's home, strangled, and buried in the boat shed. In September, Coral moved to an apartment on Columbia Street. Brooks later stated that at this address, he had assisted Coral in kidnapping and murdering 2 unidentified young men. In the winter of 1971, Brooks met Henley and introduced him to Coral. Henley was originally lured to Coral's residence as an intended victim. However, Coral apparently thought the young man would make a good accomplice, so he also made Henley the same offer he had made to Brooks, $200 for any boy he could lure to his apartment, while telling Henley that he worked for a white slavery gang. Henley later said that for the first few months he ignored this tempting offer but still maintained an acquaintance with Coral, gradually beginning to see him as a brotherly figure because he admired Coral's work ethic and considered him a man worth confiding in. In early 1972, due to Henley and his family's poor financial situation, Henley accepted Coral's offer. His first participation in a kidnapping occurred in late February or early March when he met a boy on the street, promising to take him to smoke marijuana and luring him to Coral's house. At this point, he had no idea that the boy would be sold to a slave gang, but in reality, the unidentified boy became Coral's prey. On March 24th, Henley, along with Brooks and Coral, encountered his 18-year-old acquaintance, Frank Aguirre. He called Aguirre over to Coral's van, inviting the young man to drink beer and smoke marijuana with the 3 of them at Coral's apartment. Aguirre agreed, and they smoked marijuana together. However, suddenly, he noticed a pair of handcuffs left on the table by Coral and felt something was wrong. Aguirre wanted to run away, but it was already too late. Coral pushed him onto the table and cuffed his hands behind his back. At this point, Henley realized that Coral's intention was definitely not to sell Aguirre to a slave gang. But when he heard Coral admit to having raped, tortured, and killed the previous victims he had assisted in kidnapping, he understood that he had already stepped into an abyss from which there was no turning back. On April 20th, Henley assisted Brooks and Coral in kidnapping another young man, 17-year-old Mark Scott, who was one of Coral's intended victims because he had deceived Coral in a previous deal. They forcibly grabbed Scott, who was very tenacious. Even after being abused for several hours, the young man still tried to stab Coral with a knife. But eventually, when he saw Henley pointing a gun at him, Scott realized he could no longer resist. He gave up struggling and resigned himself to his fate. Initially, Henley did participate in the murders as an uninformed party. But as multiple murders occurred, his psychology became twisted. He gradually became curious about how much patience humans could have, so he was by no means a victim who was always forced to participate in the murders. Before June 26th, Henley also assisted Brooks and Coral in kidnapping and murdering two young men named Billy Balch and Johnny Dellum. According to Brooks' testimony, both young men were tied to Coral's bed. After being tortured and sexually assaulted, Balch was strangled to death by Henley, while Dellum was shot to death by him with a pistol. During Coral's residence on Schuler Street, he, along with Brooks and Henley, lured a 19-year-old young man named William Lettinger to their residence. The young man was initially tied to hooks on the wall and then to a plywood board, where he suffered torture and abuse at the hands of Coral. Brooks later claimed that after he persuaded Coral to release Lettinger, the next time he entered the house, Henley knocked him unconscious. Coral then tied Brooks to the bed and repeatedly assaulted the young man before finally releasing him. In the summer of 1972, Coral killed two victims. The first victim was 17-year-old Stephen Sickman, who was last seen leaving a party in Heights shortly before midnight on July 19th. The young man was brutally beaten in the chest with a blunt object, then strangled and buried in the boat shed. Around August 21st, 19-year-old Roy Button was kidnapped on his way to work as an assistant at a shoe store in Houston. His mouth was taped shut, and he was shot twice in the head before being buried in the boat shed. It wasn't until 2011 that they were identified as Coral's victims. On October 3rd, Brooks and Henley encountered two young men, Wally J. Simonet and Richard Hembree, who were walking home. They were lured into Brooks' car and taken to Coral's apartment. That night, Simonet secretly called his mother's house and shouted the word "Mom" into the receiver before the call was disconnected. The next morning, Henley accidentally shot Hembree in the mouth, with the bullet exiting through his neck. A few hours later, both young men were strangled and subsequently buried in a mass grave. Sometime in November, 18-year-old Willard Branch disappeared while hitchhiking from Mount Pleasant to Houston, and his body was buried in the boat shed. On November 11th, 19-year-old Richard Kepner disappeared on his way to a phone booth. He was strangled and buried on High Island Beach. Between March and November 1972, at least 10 teenagers aged between 13 and 19 were murdered, with 5 buried on Mustang Island Beach and 5 in the boat shed. On January 20th, 1973, Coral moved to Wirt Road in the Spring Branch area of Houston. Within 2 weeks of moving into this address, he killed 17-year-old Joseph Lyles. On March 1st, Coral moved out of this apartment and briefly stayed in an apartment on South Post Oak Road before moving to the address 2020 Lamar Drive, which his father had vacated in Pasadena. Between February 1st and June 4th, Coral had no known victims killed. Records show that he suffered from hydrocele in early 1973, which may have been the reason for his inactivity during this period. Additionally, around the time of Lyle's murder, Henley went to Florida with his uncle, a long-distance truck driver, and moved to Mount Pleasant, apparently to distance himself from Coral. Perhaps at this point, he had already begun to have thoughts of rebellion, but after so many murders, he could no longer return to normal life in society. Starting in June, Coral's killing frequency increased sharply. Henley and Brooks later testified that the brutality of the murders he committed while living on Lamar Drive had increased. Henley later compared Coral's escalation to being like bloodthirsty, and added that he and Brooks would instinctively know when Coral announced he needed a new boy, because Coral would become restless, smoke, and make fidgeting movements. On June 4th, Coral and Henley kidnapped 15-year-old William Ray Lawrence. The teenager was last seen by his father on the street. After 3 days of abuse and torture, Lawrence was strangled and then buried in Lake Sam, Rayburn. 2 weeks later, 20-year-old Raymond Stanley Blackburn was kidnapped, strangled, and buried in the same place. On July 6th, Henley started school, where he met 15-year-old Homer Louis Garcia. The next day, Garcia called his mother, saying he was going to spend the night with a friend. Instead, he was shot and bled to death in Coral's bathtub and was buried in Lake Sam, Rayburn. 5 days later, 17-year-old John Sellers from Orange County was tied up, shot, and buried on High Island Beach. In July 1973, Brooks married his pregnant fiancée, and Henley temporarily became Coral's only accomplice. Between July 19th and 25th, he assisted in the kidnapping and murder of 3 young men. Henley claimed that these were the only 3 kidnappings that occurred after he became Coral's accomplice in which Brooks did not participate. On August 3rd, Coral killed his last victim, 13-year-old James Stanton Dramala from South Houston. The boy was kidnapped while riding his bicycle. In Coral's home, he was tied to a torture board, raped, tortured, and strangled with a rope, and then buried in the boat shed. Brooks later described Dramala as a blonde, blue-eyed little boy, and he even bought him a pizza. On the evening of August 7th, the whole story came to an end. Henley invited 20-year-old Timothy Cordell Kelly to a party hosted by Coral. Since Kelly also knew Coral, he accepted the invitation. Brooks was not present at the time. After the party started, Coral did not make a move but drank and smoked marijuana with the 2 of them. Then Henley and Kelly left, promising to return soon. They drove back to Henley's home together. After getting out of the car, Henley heard a commotion coming from the home of his 15-year-old friend Rhonda Louise Williams, so he walked towards her house. Williams was bandaging her sprained ankle at the time, and she was being beaten by her drunk father. Then Henley invited Williams to rest at Coral's home. Around 3 a.m. on August 8th, the 3 young people returned to the apartment, but Coral was very angry because he did not allow girls in his apartment at all. Coral told Henley in private that he had ruined everything, and Henley explained that Williams had argued with her father that night and did not want to go home. Then Coral became a bit silent. He offered beer and marijuana to the 3 of them, but he did not touch it himself. About 2 hours later, the 3 young people passed out. When Henley woke up again, he found himself lying on the ground with his wrists cuffed, his mouth taped shut, and his ankles tied together. The other 2 young people were in the same condition, and Kelly's clothes had been stripped off. Then Coral noticed Henley was awake, so he removed the tape from Henley's mouth. Henley protested in vain, accusing Coral of his actions, but Coral was unmoved. He once again expressed his anger at Henley for bringing the girl back and said he planned to kill all 3 of them after assaulting and torturing Kelly. Coral said, "Man, you brought this girl here," and then shouted, "I'm going to kill all of you, but first I'm going to have some fun." Next, Coral dragged Henley to the kitchen, pressed a pistol against Henley's abdomen, and threatened to shoot him. Henley tried to calm Coral down, promising that if Coral released him, he would participate in the torture and murder of Williams and Kelly. After about 30 minutes, Coral agreed. He untied Henley's restraints and then took Williams and Kelly to his bedroom, tying them to both sides of the torture board. Then Coral handed Henley a hunting knife and ordered him to cut off Williams's clothes, saying that while he would rape and kill Kelly, Henley also had to do the same to Williams. So Henley began to cut off Williams's clothes, and Coral took off his clothes and started to torture Kelly. At this point, both victims had woken up. Kelly began to twist and shout, and Williams raised her head and asked, "Is this real?" Henley replied, "Yes." Williams continued to ask, "What are you going to do?" Then Henley asked Coral if he could take Williams to another room. At this point, he already had the idea of releasing his friend, but Coral ignored him. So he grabbed Coral's pistol and said, "Dean, you've gone far enough. I can't go on anymore. I can't let you kill all my friends." Coral approached Henley and said, "Kill me, you won't do it." But facing the threatening approach, Henley chose to shoot, hitting Coral in the forehead. However, the bullet did not fully penetrate his skull, so Coral continued to charge at Henley. Henley fired 2 more shots, hitting Coral in the left shoulder. Feeling the pain, Coral turned and ran out, hitting the corridor wall. Henley then fired 3 more shots at Coral's waist and shoulder, and he slowly fell to the floor, dead on the spot. At 8:24 a.m. on August 8th, Henley called the Pasadena Police Department. He told the operator on the phone, "You'd better come over now. I just killed a man. The address is 2020 Lamar Drive." A few minutes later, a patrol car arrived. Williams and Kelly were sitting by the roadside crying, while Henley was staring blankly across the street. After seeing the police, he told the officer that he was the one who made the call and indicated that the body was inside the house. The officer then confiscated the pistol, put the 3 young men into the patrol car, and went into the house. After finding Coral's body in the hallway, he returned to the car and took the 3 to the police station. Kelly later told the detective that before the police arrived, Henley had said to him, "If you guys weren't my friends, I could have gotten $200. During his detention, when initially questioned about Coral's killing, Henley recounted the events of the previous night and that morning, explaining that he had fired the shots in self-defense. The statements of Kelly and Williams corroborated his account, and the detective questioning Henley also believed that he had acted in self-defense. Henley went on to say that for nearly 3 years, he and Brooks had been helping Coral kidnap teenage boys for him to rape and murder, some of whom were their own friends. He said that initially he thought the boys he kidnapped would be sold to an organization in Dallas for homosexual acts, sodomy, and perhaps later murder, but he soon realized that Coral was killing the kidnapped victims. The police were initially skeptical of Henley's claims, considering the only victim in the case to be Coral, attributing it to drug-induced violent behavior. However, Henley was very insistent. When he recalled the names of 3 boys, Coble, Hillegiest, and Jones, and said that he and Brooks had kidnapped them for Coral, the police found his story plausible, as these 3 teenagers were all listed as missing. In addition, the floor of Coral's room was covered with thick plastic sheeting. The police also found a torture board with handcuffs tied to 2 corners and nylon rope tied to the other 2 corners, as well as a large hunting knife. There was a roll of the same type of transparent plastic on the floor, a portable radio mounted on a pair of dry batteries with the volume turned up, an electric motor connected to loose wires, 8 pairs of handcuffs, thin glass tubes, and long ropes. Coral's van also gave a similar impression. The rear windows of the van were sealed with blue curtains. In the back of the vehicle, the police found a coil of rope, a beige carpet stained with dirt, and a wooden box with air holes drilled in the side. The rear of the van had a pegboard wall with several rings and hooks, and a wooden box was also found in the backyard. There were several strands of human hair in this crate. At the request of the police, Henley agreed to accompany them to Coral's boat shed in southwestern Houston, where he claimed several victims' remains could be found. Inside the boat shed, the police discovered a partially stripped stolen Chevrolet Camaro, a child's bicycle, a large iron drum, water containers, 2 bags of lime, 2 shovels, a damaged rake, and a large plastic bag filled with teenagers' clothing. It was here that they found a large number of victims. Accompanied by his father, Brooks went to the Houston Police Department on the evening of August 8th and made a statement denying any knowledge or involvement in the murders. However, he admitted to knowing that Coral had raped and killed 2 teenagers in 1970, and he mentioned the names of 2 young men, Reuben Haney and Mark Scott, who had been seen with Coral before their disappearance. On the morning of August 9th, Henley provided a full written statement detailing the process of him and Brooks' involvement with Coral in the kidnapping and murder of many young men. In this confession, Henley admitted to personally killing about 9 young men and assisting Coral in strangling the others. He said that there were only 3 murder cases in which Brooks did not assist them. That afternoon, Henley accompanied the police to Sam Rayburn Lake, where he, Brooks, and Coral had buried 4 victims killed that year. 2 more remains were found in shallow, lime-soaked graves near a dirt road. Inside a lakeside cabin, the police discovered a second plywood torture board, rolls of plastic sheeting, shovels, and a bag of lime. On the evening of August 9th, Brooks confessed to the full extent of his crimes, admitting to participating in several murders and assisting in several burials, although he continued to deny direct involvement in the killings. When talking about the torture board used by Coral to restrain and torture the victims, Brooks said, "Once they were on the board, they were as good as dead. It was all over. All that was left was screaming and crying." Speaking of the actual murders, he stated that witnessing the victims' deaths did not bother him, adding, "I've seen it so many times." And then he agreed to accompany the police to locate the victims' remains. At that time, in terms of the number of victims, this killing spree was the worst serial murder case in the United States, although this record was broken a few years later. The victims' families first levied severe criticism at the police department because after the boys went missing, the police only listed them as runaways, not missing persons. They believed that the boys were not considered worth any significant investigation. If the police had launched an investigation early on and established a special task force, there would not have been so many victims. On August 13th, a grand jury in Harris County convened and heard testimonies from Williams and Kelly, as well as from a victim released by Brooks, Ridinger. They recounted their experiences, and investigators also testified at the hearing, detailing the various statements and confessions provided by Henley and Brooks in the days following Coral's death, as well as the assistance in overseeing the excavation of the victims' remains. After listening to more than 6 hours of testimony, the grand jury indicted Henley on 3 counts of murder and Brooks on 1 count of murder on August 14th. The bail for each defendant was set at $100,000. Henley was not charged in connection with Coral's death, and the prosecutor ruled that Coral's death was in self-defense. On July 1st, 1974, Henley went on trial in San Antonio, charged with 6 counts of murder committed between March 1972 and July 1973. Following the advice of his defense attorney, Henley did not testify in court. His lawyer cross-examined several witnesses but did not call any witnesses or experts to testify in his defense, as it was deemed unhelpful. The prosecution called 24 witnesses, including Kelly and Ridinger, and presented 82 pieces of evidence, including Coral's torture board and one of the boxes used to transport the victims. Other incriminating testimonies came from officers who read Henley's written statements. On July 15, 1974, both attorneys presented their closing arguments to the jury. The prosecution sought a life sentence, while the defense argued for an acquittal. In the closing arguments submitted to the jury, the district attorney apologized for not being able to sentence the perpetrators to death and added that this case was the most extreme example of inhumanity he had ever seen. The jury deliberated for 92 minutes before finding Henley guilty of all 6 murder charges. On August 8th, the judge sentenced Henley to a total of 594 years in prison to be served consecutively. He was transferred to Huntsville Prison to begin his sentence formally. On February 27, 1975, Brooks went on trial, charged with 4 counts of murder committed between December 1970 and June 1973, but ultimately only charged with the murder of 15-year-old Lawrence in June 1973. His defense attorney argued that his client had not committed any murders and attempted to portray Coral and Henley as the active participants in the actual killings. The assistant district attorney flatly rejected the defense's arguments, telling the jury, "This defendant was involved in this killing from the very beginning, this killing spree. He tells you that if it weren't for an accident, he was a cheerleader. That's what he tells you about his role. You know he was involved." Brooks' trial lasted less than a week, and the jury reached a verdict in just 90 minutes. On March 4, 1975, he was found guilty of murdering Lawrence and sentenced to life in prison. At the sentencing, Brooks showed no emotion, although his wife burst into tears. Henley is serving a life sentence at the Mark Stiles Unit in Jefferson County, Texas. Since July 1980, his consecutive parole applications have been denied, and he will next be eligible for parole in October of this year. Brooks was serving a life sentence at the Terrell Unit near Rocharon, Texas. On May 28, 2020, he died of complications related to COVID-19 at a Galveston hospital at the age of 65. In the early 20th century, a widow in her 60s sat in the living room of her boarding house as usual. In her hand was a tattered prayer book, ready to pray for herself. This woman ran the boarding house alone. In the past, she had made a living by renting out rooms. Although her life was not affluent, she always tried her best to create a cozy home for her tenants. On that evening, a young man named Earl Leonard Nelson arrived at her door. He claimed to be a devout Christian looking for a quiet place to rest. His appearance was gentle and polite, which put the woman at ease. She welcomed him warmly, as she did with other tenants, showing him around the rooms and explaining the rules of the house in detail. Nelson behaved respectfully during the tour, and his demeanor convinced the woman that he would be an ideal tenant. However, she had no idea that this seemingly pious young man harbored dark impulses within, nor could she imagine that this night would be her last. As dusk fell and the entire boarding house fell silent, she sat alone in the living room, preparing to begin her evening prayers once again. She had no idea that her new tenant had a nickname, the Gorilla Killer, and that she was about to become another victim of his brutal murders. The tragedy began on May 12, 1897, when Nelson was born in San Francisco, California. If life were to improve after hitting rock bottom, then for Nelson, his entire life was one of misfortune. It is said that his father was a drunkard and his mother a sex worker. Within just 2 years of his birth, both of them died of syphilis. Nelson's grandparents, devout Pentecostals, then took on the responsibility of raising their daughter's child. However, their age and personalities were not well suited to caring for a young boy. They lived a strict Puritan lifestyle, constantly suppressing their own emotions and feelings. For Nelson, a natural troublemaker, this stern family atmosphere was sheer torment. As a result, Nelson exhibited self-loathing and other pathological behaviors from a young age. At the age of 7, he was expelled from school for misbehavior. His teachers complained that the boy constantly talked to invisible people and frequently referenced a large beast from the Bible. He also had a habit of peeking at female family members undressing. So Nelson was described by everyone as a psychotic child. Even his own grandmother thought so. She noted that Nelson would sometimes go to school in freshly cleaned clothes, only to return home in tattered garments, as if he had exchanged clothes with a homeless person. When Nelson was 10 years old, he was involved in an accident with a streetcar while riding his bicycle. Blood gushed from one of his temples, and after the doctor's best efforts, they believed he would not survive. Strangely, however, he awoke from a coma just a few days later, but the accident haunted him for the rest of his life. He suffered from frequent headaches and memory loss, and began to exhibit unstable behavior. As Nelson entered his teenage years and puberty, his curiosity about women grew stronger. He frequently visited the brothels and bars in San Francisco's Barbary Coast red light district and contracted a sexually transmitted disease. His mental illness also worsened. He often subjected his family members to bizarre physical acts, such as walking on his hands or attempting to lift heavy objects with his teeth. Nelson had suffered a head injury that led to a decrease in his intelligence and significant memory loss. In 1918, a Navy psychiatrist indicated that Nelson was living in a constitutional psychopathic state, which means he had congenital psychopathy. This implied that he had difficulties in cognition and behavioral control, making his criminal activities almost inevitable. At the age of 18, Nelson went to a rural area in Plumas County, where he broke into a cabin, thinking it was abandoned, and took it over. For this offense, he was sentenced to 2 years in San Quentin State Prison. Although he was paroled after a year, over the next 2 years, Nelson was frequently arrested for minor thefts and burglaries. At the end of 1917, Nelson enlisted in the military but deserted after 6 weeks. This became a pattern for him as he repeatedly joined different branches of the military under various names and then deserted. In 1918, at the age of 21, Nelson joined the U.S. Navy. During a military training session, his bizarre and unstable behavior led to his admission to Napa State Mental Hospital. After observation, one psychiatrist concluded that Nelson did not exhibit violence, homicidal tendencies, or destructiveness. Another psychiatrist noted that Nelson had hallucinations and other paranoid delusions. Nelson often claimed to see people that others could not see, hear music that others could not hear, and sometimes believed that someone was poisoning him. He also heard strange and terrifying voices urging him to commit suicide. The poor man, Nelson, stated that if he were imprisoned, he would surely take some sharp object and cut the veins in his wrists. This psychiatrist also mentioned that Nelson experienced severe headaches during their conversations and had fainted on multiple occasions. During his confinement, Nelson attempted to escape several times until the staff eventually stopped searching for him. In 1919, Nelson was officially discharged from the U.S. Navy, and his hospital records were closed with a note indicating that his condition had improved after treatment. After escaping, Nelson found a job as a janitor at St. Mary's Hospital. This job required no skills or qualifications. It was here that he met Mary Martin, a 60-year-old administrator. The two began dating and reportedly got married, but the marriage was short-lived. Nelson turned the woman's life into a living hell with his strange jealousy and anger, bizarre sexual demands, religious delusions, and increasingly violent behavior. This led to their separation after just 6 months of cohabitation. Later, Martin recalled various strange behaviors she had witnessed while living with Nelson, including his long absences from home and unusual bathing habits, such as pouring water over his toes. On May 19, 1921, Nelson posed as a plumber and entered a residence on Pacific Avenue in San Francisco, where he attempted to molest a 12-year-old girl. However, the girl was very clever. She screamed frantically, trying to alert her brother to call for help, which caused Nelson to flee in fear. He was arrested a few hours later while riding a handcart. At the subsequent hearing, Nelson was identified as a dangerous individual and was sent back to Napa State Mental Hospital. There, he attempted to escape twice before being discharged in 1925. In 1926, Nelson began his horrific spree of murders. His first known victim was Clara Newman, a 60-year-old wealthy landlady living in San Francisco. On February 20th, he posed as a new tenant named Roger Wilson and entered her boarding house at 2037 Pierce Street. Once inside, Nelson strangled her, raped her corpse, and hid her body in an empty room in the house. Just a month later, on March 2nd, his second victim emerged. In San Jose, near San Francisco, 63-year-old Laura Beale was strangled to death in her home. His criminal actions then became more frequent. On June 26th, he strangled 63-year-old Lillian Mary in San Francisco and raped her corpse. 2 weeks later, he continued his crimes in California. In Santa Barbara, 325 miles south of San Francisco, 53-year-old Ollie Russell was strangled with a rope in her boarding house. The autopsy confirmed that she had been sexually assaulted after death. The similarities in the modus operandi to the San Francisco murders led the police to suspect a connection between these cases. On August 16th, Mary Nisbet, a 52-year-old apartment building owner in Oakland, was found dead in the bathroom of an empty apartment by her husband. She had been strangled and raped. Initially, local law enforcement questioned whether Nisbet's husband was involved in her death, but he was soon cleared of suspicion. Later, witnesses told the police that they had seen a smiling stranger lurking outside her apartment building on the day of Nisbet's murder. Others who claimed to have seen Nelson at various boarding houses described him as a dark, stocky man with long arms and large hands. Because of this, newspapers began to call him the Dark Strangler and the Gorilla Killer. In the fall, Nelson moved to Portland, Oregon. On October 19th, he raped and murdered 35-year-old landlady Beata Withers, the first of several victims he would kill in Portland. Her body was discovered by her teenage son, hidden under clothes in a steamer trunk in her attic. The next day, 59-year-old Virginia Grant was murdered in a vacant property on East 22nd Street, with her body concealed behind a basement furnace in her home. On October 21st, landlady Mabel Fluke disappeared from her home in Portland. A few days later, her body was found in the attic, strangled with a scarf. After committing 3 murders in Portland, Nelson briefly returned to San Francisco and raped and murdered 56-year-old widow Willie Anna Edmonds on November 18th. Initially, the police were reluctant to attribute the crime to the Dark Strangler. However, a few days after the murder, a friend of Edmonds told the police that she had visited Edmonds' home on the day of the murder and found her in the living room talking to a strange man about a business deal involving the sale of her house. The woman's description of the unknown man matched that of the Gorilla Killer. On November 19th, a 28-year-old pregnant woman near Burlingame, California, was attacked while showing her house to a man posing as a potential buyer. She survived the assault and described the man as about 5 feet 8 inches tall, well-dressed, and articulate. The woman later told reporters that although she had not felt threatened initially, she recalled that the man had commented on the intricate details of the house, especially the ceilings. "I now realize that he was trying to get me to look up at the ceiling so he could slip behind me and grab my throat," she said. On November 29th, Nelson murdered and raped Blanche Myers at her home in Portland. During the investigation, police found a fingerprint on Myers' iron bedpost. Although fingerprint technology was still in its early stages at the time, this discovery was undoubtedly a significant breakthrough. The Portland murders also sparked a public frenzy, with the Oregonian reporting that the 3rd floor of the Portland Police Department had turned into a veritable madhouse, with officers receiving hundreds of calls and reports of suspicious individuals. A local woman claimed that a suspicious man had stayed at her boarding house for a few days after Thanksgiving under the name Adrian Harris. She said that on the day Myers was murdered, the man had told her and other residents that he was leaving to take a train to Vancouver and would not be back. She found this suspicious because he had already paid for several days' rent in advance. Before leaving, he had also given her and another boarder jewelry as a gift. The police later confirmed that the jewelry belonged to Florence Monks, a wealthy widow who had been murdered and raped in Seattle on November 23rd. To prevent further murders, law enforcement agencies in California and Oregon issued public safety announcements to citizens. In the San Francisco Bay Area, elderly women were advised to take precautions when renting out rooms and inviting strangers into their homes. Meanwhile, the Portland Police Department issued the following statement to the public: "Do not show your house or rooms for rent when you are alone. If necessary, ask the police to accompany you. Such crimes should be prevented. They could have been avoided if women had been more careful." I do not want to unduly alarm the people of Portland, but there is no denying that the situation is serious. In late November, Nelson left Portland and continued his killing spree, moving eastward and traveling by hitchhiking or sneaking onto trains. His criminal trail stretched from the West Coast to the Midwest and East Coast of the United States. On December 23rd, the body of 41-year-old Amira Berard was found in her home in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Her body was garlanded with a shirt. Initially, local police ruled her death as a suicide, as Berard had recently been discharged from a mental hospital. However, subsequent findings of signs of sexual assault led to the reversal of this decision, and the case was reclassified as a murder. On December 27, 23-year-old Bonnie Pace was strangled and raped in her home in Kansas City, Missouri. Her body was discovered by her husband in an upstairs room. Just 1 day later, on December 28th, 28-year-old Germania Harpen and her 8-month-old son were found murdered in their home in Kansas City. Both had been strangled, her son with a diaper, and Germania had been raped after death. They were discovered by her husband when he returned home from work that evening. On April 27, 1927, Nelson murdered and raped 53-year-old landlady Mary McConnell in Philadelphia. Several pieces of jewelry were also stolen from her residence. The next day, Nelson attempted to sell one of her gold watches to a pawnbroker, but was refused. On May 27th, Nelson arrived in Buffalo, New York, where he rented a room from 53-year-old Jenny Randolph under the name Charles Harrison. 3 days later, Jenny was found strangled and raped, her body stuffed under her bed. Jenny's brother had encountered Harrison, describing him as appearing about 33 years old, short and stout, with dark complexion and black hair combed back. Boarders at Jenny's house later positively identified Nelson as Charles Harrison. On June 1st in Detroit, Michigan, boarding house manager Fannie Mae and boarder Maureen Atorthy were found murdered in the boarding house under Mae's supervision. Their remains were discovered by the building's owner, Leonard Sink. Mae had been strangled with a wire cut from a table lamp. Police determined that the wire had been cut while the electricity was still running, as the knife used to cut it showed obvious signs of burning and a notched blade. On June 3rd, he murdered 27-year-old Mary Cecilia Sitzma in Chicago, Illinois. Sitzma was found by her husband on the floor of their home, strangled with an electrical cord. On June 8th, a series of shocking murders occurred in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. 14-year-old Lola Cowan mysteriously disappeared after leaving home to sell artificial flowers door to door. Just 2 days later, on June 10th, another local woman also vanished. That evening, her husband discovered her body while kneeling beside his son's bed for evening prayers. She had been raped, strangled, and showed signs of being struck with a claw hammer. Upon investigation, police found that several items were missing from her home, including a set of riding reins, her gold wedding ring, a family Bible, and a $10 bill. Additionally, a knife with burn marks and scratches was left at the scene, matching the knife used to cut the lamp wire in Mae's murder the previous week. This discovery led police to realize the connection between the cases. The next day, a local Winnipeg jeweler unknowingly purchased a gold ring for $3.50 Canadian dollars from a man who later turned out to be Nelson. The ring was confirmed to be the woman's wedding ring. Stolen clothes from her home were also found being sold at a second-hand store nearby. Both the jeweler and the clothing store owner positively identified the man who had sold the items as Nelson. A barber who owned a shop next to the second-hand store also provided a crucial lead to the police. He said that on the afternoon of June 10th, he had given a shave, haircut, and massage to a man who closely resembled Nelson. While cutting the man's hair, he noticed dried blood and scratches on his scalp. When he inquired about the source of these marks, the man became agitated and demanded that he not touch his hair. On June 12th, Winnipeg police conducted a city-wide search of rooming houses. While searching the boarding house at 133 Smith Street, where Nelson had recently resided, police discovered a decomposing body under the bed in Nelson's room. It was the missing Cowan, whose body had been dismembered in a manner reminiscent of Jack the Ripper's victims. Her clothes and personal items were also missing. After the discovery of Cowan's body, the Winnipeg City Council offered a reward of $1,500 Canadian dollars for information leading to the conviction of the perpetrator. This reward subsequently became a matter of controversy, with several individuals coming forward with information about Nelson's whereabouts, including a driver who claimed to have transported Nelson from Emerson to Winnipeg on the day Cowan disappeared. In June 1927, while investigating the Winnipeg murders, Canadian police suspected that Nelson might have fled to the United States. To locate him quickly, they sent detailed descriptions of him to police departments and post offices across the United States. During this period, reports surfaced of sightings of a man matching Nelson's description in Regina, Saskatchewan, and in Boissavin, Manitoba. On June 14th, a man identifying himself as Mike Mofsky was arrested by customs officers in the small town of Wauwunessa, on the border between Manitoba and Minnesota. This man's appearance closely matched Nelson's description, but he managed to escape the next day. Just 2 days later, on June 16th, in the border town of Killinick, Manitoba, only 12 miles from the North Dakota border, officers arrested a man named Vigil Wilson, who also fit Nelson's description. Reportedly, the man was so calm and cooperative during his arrest that officers even doubted they had the right person. Nelson was detained in a local jail, but he managed to escape that very night. However, fate was not on his side. He attempted to flee by train, but the next morning he was formally arrested again by an officer from the Crystal City Police Department on a railway line 47 miles east of Wauwunessa. He was then taken to the Rupert Street Police Station in Winnipeg, where he was photographed, fingerprinted, measured, and prepared for identification. Nearly 4,000 spectators waited outside the station, hoping to catch a glimpse of the suspect. The photographs taken by the Winnipeg police were quickly sent to police departments across the United States, leading to positive identifications by witnesses in Illinois and California, who claimed that the man matched the same unidentified renter they had encountered. Despite Nelson's insistence that his name was Vigil Wilson, fingerprints forwarded from the San Francisco Police Department to Winnipeg confirmed that his identity matched the one from his previous arrests. Nelson's fingerprints also matched those found at multiple crime scenes, and his teeth matched the marks found on the victims. Initially, he confessed to the crimes, candidly telling reporters, "I only kill my ladies on Saturday nights." However, he later retracted his confession, claiming innocence. Shortly after his arrest, in an interview with the Manitoba Free Press, he said, "I am charged with 2 murders, but I am not the one who committed them." When asked about the individuals in the United States and Canada who positively identified him as the perpetrator, he simply replied, "They are all mistaken." Despite attempts by law enforcement agencies in both the United States and Canada to extract a confession, Nelson refused to admit to any of the murders he was suspected of or charged with. Nelson's trial began on November 1, 1927, at the Winnipeg courthouse. His former wife, Martin, testified against him, describing him as a man who was absolutely insane. In addition, over 60 witnesses from both Canada and the United States testified that they had seen Nelson at the crime scenes, or could link him to the stolen property from the victims' homes. During the trial, a prison guard noted that Nelson was particularly fascinated by a passage from the book of Proverbs, which reads, "My son, give me thine heart, and let thine eyes observe my ways. For a whore is a deep ditch, and a strange woman is a narrow pit. She also lieth in wait as for a prey, and increaseth the transgressors among men." On November 5th, the closing arguments were completed, and after 40 minutes of deliberation, the jury unanimously found Nelson guilty of murder and sentenced him to death. Nelson maintained his innocence throughout the trial, but he was unable to counter the evidence presented by the police. However, his attorney never gave up on him. He submitted a 30-page document to the Minister of Justice, pleading for leniency for Nelson on the grounds of his mental derangement and congenital psychopathy. Nelson's personal history had also been unfairly presented to the jury by the media, meaning that the jurors were not impartial. They might have been predisposed to believe Nelson was guilty. These documents included 20 affidavits from people who had known Nelson all their lives, swearing that they could fully understand Nelson's character and state of mind. They unreservedly and without exaggeration believed that Nelson had been mentally unsound for a long period of time. Despite the numerous affidavits, the appeal was denied, and Nelson's execution was not stayed. At 7:30 a.m. on January 13, 1928, at Vaughan Street Jail in Winnipeg, Nelson was hanged. His last words were, "I forgive those who have wronged me." In 20th century Florida, there was a tranquil canal that connected Tampa Bay. A man named Oba Chandler lived there. Always wearing a smile and ready to help others, he left a friendly impression on his neighbors. But no one knows this man harbored a twisted and evil soul deep within. As dusk settled, he would always take his boat out to sea. To others, it seemed like a routine recreational activity. In reality, he was on the hunt for victims. It was a beautiful evening with warm sunshine. A mother and her 2 daughters came to Tampa Bay, their smiles as bright as the sun, completely unaware that danger was creeping up on them. Chandler, with his signature smile, invited them in a gentle voice to take a boat ride, saying he would show them the beautiful sunset over the sea. Without a second thought, the 3 of them accepted the invitation. As the boat pulled away from the shore and headed out to sea, the peaceful atmosphere was shattered. The demon revealed his sinister face. He quickly overpowered the 3, tightly binding their wrists with ropes and taping their mouths shut. They struggled in terror, but it was all in vain. He then began to sexually assault them. The mother and daughters could only endure the terrible torment helplessly, their eyes filled with fear and despair. However, he didn't rush to end it. He reveled in their suffering. Finally, he stopped, but he didn't kill them immediately. Instead, he threw them alive into the sea, deliberately keeping them conscious so they could witness each other's agony until they sank beneath the waves. The story begins on October 11, 1946, when a couple in Cincinnati, Ohio, welcomed their 4th child. From a young age, he was an extremely difficult child. He didn't think school was worth his time, so he frequently skipped classes, which led to his consistently failing grades. However, there might have been a reason for this. His father was extremely strict with the children, imposing rigid rules. For instance, he forbade his daughters from wearing revealing clothes and often punished the children with a leather razor strap. This continued until 1957, when he hanged himself in the basement. That day, Chandler's sister, Helen, discovered this horrifying reality. People were devastated by the man's death. They couldn't believe he had taken his own life and instead blamed his wife. After their father's death, Chandler and his siblings were no longer restrained. They became indulgent, and Chandler began associating with some delinquent youths. He frequently skipped school and stayed up late. At the age of 14, he was arrested for the first time for car theft, which was just the beginning of his 20 arrests before he turned 18. As an adult, Chandler was charged with a variety of crimes, including but not limited to possession of counterfeit money, burglary, kidnapping, and armed robbery. No one knew exactly when he began to exhibit predatory behavior, but when he was a teenager, he was arrested for masturbating while peeping at a woman. In one armed robbery, Chandler and his accomplices broke into a couple's home, holding guns to their heads. Besides robbing them, he had his accomplice tie up the man while he took the woman to the bedroom, forced her to strip down to her underwear, tied her up, and then slowly rubbed the barrel of the gun against her stomach. It was clear that he derived some incomprehensible sexual pleasure from this incident. Chandler was an incredibly charming man. With his thick, curly blonde hair, sharply defined jawline, and the aura of a rebellious young man, he never lacked female companionship. At the age of 16, he met Martha Lou Glass, a 14-year-old girl who was drawn to his demeanor. At that time, Chandler's life was in chaos, caught in a whirlpool of constant criminal activity. Martha, the innocent girl, was completely unaware of it all. Within 2 years of their relationship, she had given birth to 2 children. Perhaps she knew that Chandler was a free-spirited bird who could not be tamed, so she tried to tie him down with children, but things did not go as she wished. In the 3rd year of their relationship, Chandler left her and went to North Carolina to serve in the Marine Corps for a year. When he returned, everything had changed for Martha. She discovered that he was not just dating her, but several other girls at the same time, one of whom had given birth to his child. In 1969, he left Martha for good. He married another woman and, a few years later, moved to Minnesota to marry yet another. In the late 1980s, Chandler was 41 years old. Although his age had changed, his promiscuous nature remained the same. While engaged to one woman, he secretly dated another named Deborah Whiteman. Deborah was a good woman, prettier and younger. She didn't ask about his past or care what he did when she wasn't around. On May 14, 1988, Chandler married Deborah. Their life seemed smooth. In a short time, they had a daughter, bought a house, and a boat. Drifting on the open waters of the bay, Chandler had achieved the 3 things many middle-aged men wanted: to be alone, away from the demands of his wife and newborn child. However, when a criminal feels content, a truly chilling idea can be born. On May 14, 1989, in Madeira Beach, Florida, the sun was shining brightly. 2 young Canadian female tourists, Judy Blair and Barbara Mottram, met a man in a convenience store. He introduced himself as Dave Posno, claiming to own an aluminum company in Bradenton. His warm and charming smile put the 2 girls at ease. The next morning, Dave, who was actually Chandler, invited them to go out on his boat. Judy accepted the invitation while Barbara chose to stay on shore. The first outing was enjoyable. Chandler behaved politely, even gentlemanly. However, when he proposed taking them out again that evening to watch the sunset, things began to feel off. In the evening, Judy arrived at the dock alone, ready to board Chandler's boat. Chandler was clearly displeased that Barbara hadn't shown up, but he maintained a polite facade. At first, everything seemed normal, but as the boat left the shore, Chandler's behavior changed. He began to touch and hug Judy, trying to kiss her and telling her that he wanted to have sex. Judy refused him in terror. Chandler didn't stop. His eyes gleamed with a threatening light as he hissed in a low voice, "Is sex worth dying for?" Judy pleaded with him to spare her, telling him she was a virgin, but this only seemed to excite him more. He pinned her down and raped her on the boat's deck. Judy's cries and pleas for mercy were drowned out by the sound of the waves. She could only endure the terrible ordeal helplessly. Afterward, Chandler turned the boat around and began heading back to shore. On the way back, he seemed agitated, speaking quickly and trying to make small talk with Judy, but the traumatized Judy could hardly speak. She huddled in the corner of the boat, silently watching him. He didn't kill Judy, perhaps because Barbara hadn't appeared. He knew that if Judy died, she would recognize him. It was a stroke of luck, but also Judy's only chance of survival. The next day, Judy mustered the courage to report the rape to the Madeira Beach police. Although forensic evidence couldn't be collected, she provided a detailed description of the attacker's appearance and the process of the assault. On June 1st, 1989, 37-year-old Joan Rogers was on vacation in Orlando, Florida, with her 17-year-old daughter Michelle and her 14-year-old daughter Christie. They had been on a road trip to Florida since May 26th and were planning to return to their family farm in Wiles, Ohio. Because Michelle had been raped by her Uncle John and her father had been imprisoned for another rape, Joan decided to arrange this trip to help her family temporarily escape these painful memories. That afternoon on June 1st, Joan and her daughters got lost near the bay while looking for their way back to the motel. A seemingly friendly man approached them, introduced himself as Dave Posno, and offered to help. He took out a brochure, wrote down the directions to their motel, and then invited them to join him for a sunset cruise on his boat that evening. Joan and her daughters were intrigued by the offer and excitedly accepted. In the evening, Joan and her daughters met Chandler at the public boat launch as planned. The golden glow of the setting sun reflected on the water, masking the darkness that was about to unfold. As the boat moved away from the shore, Chandler revealed his true nature. He tied their wrists behind their backs with yellow ropes and taped their mouths shut. It is likely that he sexually assaulted them before tying ropes around their necks, with each rope's end attached to a 30-pound concrete block. His cruelty was not only in his violent acts, but also in the psychological torture he inflicted on his victims. He did not choose to kill them quickly. Instead, he deliberately made their exposed eyes see each other's torment, ensuring they felt the utmost pain in their final moments. Then, he threw them alive into the sea, where they struggled for hours before eventually drowning. On June 4th, they were found floating on the surface of Tampa Bay. Although they had been weighted down by the concrete blocks tied around their necks, the gas produced by decomposition caused their remains to rise to the surface after death. The mother and daughters were found face down, bound at the waist and below, with Michelle's hand partially freed from the ropes, but not enough to escape. Due to the hot weather, their remains had already decomposed significantly. A week later, Michelle's father reported their disappearance. The manager of the hotel where they had stayed also confirmed that their clients were 3 women, and their rooms showed no signs of occupancy. Based on fingerprints and dental records, the victims were identified as Joan, Michelle, and Christie. The initial police investigation was misdirected. They believed that there was more than one perpetrator, considering that Michelle's Uncle John and her father had criminal records. The possibility of a family-related crime seemed high, so the investigation focused primarily on these 2 individuals. However, the lead detective on the case came across the report of the Madeira Beach rape, which Judy had filed. They noticed too many similarities between the 2 cases. Being approached by a stranger on the shore, being invited onto a boat for an evening tour, and then being abused and sexually assaulted. When they investigated Dave Posno, they found no one by that name in the area. So they created a composite sketch based on Judy's description of the suspect and distributed it widely, hoping to gather more information. Meanwhile, Chandler's mood became increasingly irritable. After the police released the composite sketch, he disappeared without telling his wife where he was going. In fact, Chandler fled to Cincinnati, where he stayed in a seedy motel. He then contacted his daughter and told her that the Florida police were after him for sexually assaulting and murdering 3 women. His daughter later relayed this information to her mother, Deborah. In fact, Deborah had already seen the composite sketch in the news and thought it resembled her husband. However, when her daughter told her what Chandler had said, she was unwilling to believe that her husband could commit such heinous acts. She refused to accept the news. When Chandler returned home, Deborah eventually confronted him. She was extremely conflicted. She knew that her husband was most likely a rapist and murderer, but when she heard him deny it, she felt a sense of relief. Even though she understood that his denials were probably lies, she chose to believe him and never brought up the matter again. It had been a long time since the detectives released the composite sketch of the suspect. They had received hundreds of tips about the man in the sketch, but none of them were correct. Nearly 3 years after the crimes, they still couldn't even confirm the identity of the suspect. On November 27, 1990, a heinous murder took place at the Sawgrass Mills Shopping Center in Florida. Ivelisse Barrios Begueras, a 20-year-old young woman who worked at a sports store, was killed. At that time, he had spotted Ivelisse at the shopping center and began to follow her. He stalked her for 2 days, during which he secretly slashed her car tires. When she discovered the damage, he pretended to run into her by chance and offered to drive her home. Ivelisse had no idea that she had already fallen into a dangerous trap. After bringing Ivelisse back to his residence, he tied her up, sexually assaulted her, and then brutally strangled her. A few hours later, Ivlis's body was found under the mailbox of a local residence. In 1991, Chandler became an informant for the U.S. Customs and the Tampa Police Department. Since he had always been on the fringes of criminal activity, he was a valuable source of information for the police. After the identities of Joan, Michelle, and Christ were confirmed, investigators found a Clearwater Beach brochure in their car during the search. It contained a handwritten route of their road trip. One of the routes to a motel had a very strange handwriting style that did not belong to any of the three women. It was particularly unique. With no other options, investigators pinned their hopes on the handwriting. They believed that the route was drawn by the suspect, so they put up a billboard on the highway in Tampa, displaying a copy of the strange handwriting, hoping that someone would recognize it and provide new clues. It wasn't until May 1992 that a woman contacted the St. Petersburg Police Department. She told them that she recognized the handwriting as that of a contractor she had hired, whose name was Abba Chandler. The woman still had receipts for the work he had done for her. Without a doubt, after comparison, it was the same handwriting. Judy, the surviving victim, also identified Chandler from a lineup of photos. On September 24th, Chandler was arrested at a gas station near his home on Interstate 75 in Volusia County, Florida. His fingerprints were tested and proved to be a match. Since Joan had written a description of the suspect's boat in the brochure before her death, investigators wanted to examine Chandler's boat, but it was long gone. Chandler had sold it 3 months after the murders. On November 10, 1992, Chandler was indicted by a grand jury in Pinellas County, Florida, on 3 counts of first-degree murder. His trial began on September 19, 1994. Throughout the entire trial, he maintained his innocence. In his testimony, he claimed that he did indeed meet Joan, Michelle, and Christ and gave them directions to the motel, but he never saw them again except on the news. The prosecution questioned why his boat was not at home that night, and the police had evidence that 3 calls to shore were made from his boat during the time of the murders. Chandler admitted that he was in Tampa Bay that night, but he was alone, fishing. He said he got home late because his engine wouldn't start, possibly due to a fuel line leak. He claimed he called the Coast Guard and the Florida Marine Patrol, and he flagged down a patrol boat, but both were too busy to help. He said he had to use tape to secure the ropes to get back to shore safely. However, evidence showed that there were no records of him making distress calls to the Coast Guard or Marine Patrol that night, and no Coast Guard vessels assisted him the next morning. A boat mechanic who testified for the prosecution debunked Chandler's story. His explanation for repairing the alleged fuel leak was implausible because his boat's fuel lines were positioned upward. Any leak would spray fuel into the air, not into the boat. Even if fuel did get inside the boat, it would dissolve the adhesive Chandler claimed he used to fix the leak. Under the prosecutor's questioning, Chandler said he couldn't remember because it had been too long. Judy also stood as a witness to accuse Chandler. Despite the severe psychological trauma and the additional pain of reliving the events, she detailed everything she had experienced to prove that Chandler was the man who sexually assaulted her and murdered Joan, Michelle, and Christ. Chandler's coworker testified that on June 1st, the day of the murders, Chandler bragged to him that he had a date with 3 women that night and stayed out late. The next morning, he looked noticeably tired and disheveled at work. Chandler's daughter said that at the end of 1989, her father suddenly showed up in Cincinnati and told her that he was on the run from Florida police because he had killed 3 women. Ultimately, Chandler was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death on November 4, 1994. In Florida's death row, he continued to maintain his innocence and sought legal appeals. Over time, he admitted to the Madeira Beach rape but claimed that the sex was consensual and that the victim had changed her mind during the act. Since he had already been sentenced to death, prosecutors, considering the victim's emotional well-being, did not charge him with rape. Chandler's wife, Deborah, also filed for divorce and did not allow her ex-husband to see photos of her or their children. In 2008, Chandler was placed on Florida's execution list. In fact, he was also rated as one of Florida's most notorious criminals. Reviewers said that when he sat there staring at you with that foolish smile on his face, it would make your skin crawl and tense up your entire body. The judge who presided over the trial described Chandler in an interview as a soulless man, saying that in terms of the facts and the unredeemable defendant, this was the worst case she had ever handled. On October 10, 2011, the governor signed Chandler's death warrant, with his execution scheduled for 4 p.m. on November 15, 2011. Chandler's lawyer said that Chandler had asked him not to file any frivolous appeals to save his life. He said that Chandler did not put much pressure on him to run around at the last minute looking for some miraculous way out. He would not make a fuss, nor would he lament the legal system. What he told me was, if I could find some legitimate way to prevent his execution, he hoped I would do what I could. Time quickly passed, and at 4:08 p.m. on November 15, 2011, Chandler was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Rayford. He refused to make any final statements, but left a written statement for the prison officials saying, "You are killing an innocent man today." The governor says that Chandler had killed 3 women. So he reviewed different cases, and it made sense to do so. There was never a time when this was the right case. Nevertheless, there were some people who always believed in Chandler. Chandler had many children, and one of his daughters said, "I believe they did execute an innocent man. I don't think my father could have committed such heinous crimes all by himself. There must have been more than one person involved. The fingerprints did prove that he had met them and given them directions, but that doesn't mean he killed them. I think the prosecution's evidence was very weak." One of Chandler's sons said, "I truly believe that the media had already tried and convicted him long before he went to court. The media could almost convict anyone, so I think he did not receive a fair trial." However, another of Chandler's daughters said that her father was a monster and that he got what he deserved. After Chandler's death, he was described as the loneliest person in the loneliest place on earth, the death row cell. On the night of February 17, 1970, in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the tranquil air was tinged with an ominous foreboding. That evening, a bloody tragedy tore through the community, shattering its peace. A young doctor, Jeffrey Robert MacDonald, experienced a nightmarish assault in his own home. He suffered stab wounds to his chest, bruises on his forehead, and minor injuries to his limbs. However, compared to him, the fate of his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters was far more tragic. They were killed on the spot during the attack. The surviving husband claimed that a group of intruders had broken into his home, chanting, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs," before launching a frenzied assault on his family. Yet, as the investigation deepened, the truth became increasingly murky. Jeffrey's account was riddled with inconsistencies. He, the only male in the house, had sustained the least severe injuries, while his defenseless wife and daughters suffered the most fatal blows. These incongruous details cast doubt on his story, and the mystery gradually pointed to a chilling possibility that the massacre was a cold-blooded murder orchestrated by Jeffrey himself. His image shifted from that of an innocent victim to a suspect who had meticulously planned the crime. His story shocked the entire United States and sparked decades of legal controversy and public debate. People have long questioned, was he the mastermind behind a calculated, cold-blooded murder, or was he truly an innocent victim? The story begins in the Jamaica neighborhood of Queens, New York, where on October 12, 1943, a couple welcomed their second child, Jeffrey. Despite their impoverished circumstances, the young boy did not succumb to despair. His father, though strict in his discipline, never resorted to physical abuse against his wife or children. It was precisely this environment that shaped Jeffrey's precocious character. During high school, he served as student council president and was voted by his peers as the most popular and most likely to succeed. However, his adolescence was not all glamour and accolades. At the end of 8th grade, a girl entered his life. It happened in the high school hallway, where 2 girls walked side by side, passing by Jeffrey. For some reason, her image lingered in his mind for days. 2 weeks later, Jeffrey sought her out, Colette Catherine Stevenson. They began talking and quickly formed a friendship. Their relationship progressed rapidly, and they started dating. One memorable moment was when Jeffrey and Colette sat on a balcony, holding hands while watching the movie, Summer Place. That scene left a deep impression on them. Whenever the movie's theme song played on the radio, they would instinctively turn up the volume, as if the melody was a testament to their love. However, this youthful romance did not last long. Colette abruptly announced the end of their relationship. Jeffrey was heartbroken, but he soon moved on and began a new relationship with another girl. Jeffrey excelled in high school and earned a 3-year scholarship to Princeton University. In 1962, he enrolled at Princeton to pursue pre-med studies, where he demonstrated remarkable academic talent and potential. However, his personal life was far from stable. During his 2nd year of studies, after breaking up with his new girlfriend, Jeffrey reconnected with his former flame, Colette. She was a shy girl, harboring a slight fear of the world, and Jeffrey, with his confident demeanor, became her protector, much like a knight. Yet, he was a romantic at heart and often dated other girls. When he learned that Colette was pregnant with his child, he decided to marry her. On September 14, 1963, They tied the knot in New York City, with 100 guests in attendance. The reception was held at the Fifth Avenue Hotel, and the couple later honeymooned in Cape Cod. On April 18, 1964, their first daughter, Kimberly Catherine, was born. After completing his undergraduate studies at Princeton, Jeffrey moved with his family to Chicago in the summer of 1965 to attend Northwestern University Medical School. Colette, meanwhile, gave up her studies to focus entirely on their family. On May 8, 1967, their second child, Kristen Zhang, was born. In 1968, after graduating from medical school, they relocated to Bergenfield, New Jersey. Jeffrey completed a one-year residency in thoracic surgery at New York's Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center. This period was grueling for both Jeffrey and Colette, as Jeffrey often worked 36-hour shifts, leaving him only 12 hours to rest at home, which severely limited his time with his family. After finishing his residency, Jeffrey and Colette vacationed in Aruba, and he subsequently decided to enlist in the military. On June 28, 1969, Jeffrey officially joined the U.S. Army and was sent to Fort Sam Houston in Texas for a 6-week basic medical training course for doctors. During this time, he volunteered to join the Army Special Forces, becoming a Green Beret physician. He was then assigned to Fort Moore in Georgia, where he completed airborne training. Although he initially feared deployment to Vietnam, he learned that, as a Special Forces doctor, the likelihood of being sent overseas was low. In August, Jeffrey was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, serving as a surgeon for the 3rd Special Forces Group. His wife and 2 daughters moved with him to the base, living at 544 Castle Drive, a housing area reserved for married officers, with security provided by military police. Here, Colette continued to pursue her academic dreams, aspiring to earn a bachelor's degree in English literature. Meanwhile, their 2 daughters began to develop distinct personalities. Kimberly was intelligent, shy, and feminine, while Kristen was a spirited tomboy who would even stand up for her sister if she was bullied. On December 10th, Jeffrey took on the role of preventive medical officer. By this time, Colette was pregnant with their 3rd child, a boy due in July 1970. Jeffrey was filled with anticipation for the future. He even bought a Shetland pony as a Christmas surprise for his daughters and planned to move the family to a farm in Connecticut. Colette, feeling deeply content, wrote to a university acquaintance that her life had never been so normal or happy. She expressed excitement about the upcoming arrival of their son, believing it would make their family complete. In 1970, Jeffrey was promoted to captain and planned to pursue advanced medical training at Yale University after completing his term as a Green Beret physician. At this point, his career seemed to be on a smooth trajectory, and his family life was brimming with hope and promise. However, all of this came to an abrupt end on the night of February 17, 1970. A bloody tragedy shattered his fate and obliterated the future of his family. On the afternoon of February 16, 1970, Jeffrey took his 2 daughters to feed their pony. Around 5:45 p.m., they returned home. Jeffrey took a shower and changed into an old blue pajama set. After dinner, Colette left the house to attend a night class at the University of North Carolina in Fort Bragg. According to Jeffrey's account, he played a game with his daughters, letting them ride on his back. Around 7 p.m., he put Kristen to bed and then rested himself. After waking up, he watched Kimberly's favorite TV show, Laugh-In, with her. At 9:40 p.m., Colette returned home, and the couple sat together on the couch watching TV. Midway through a program, Colette decided to go to bed, while Jeffrey fell asleep on the living room couch. At 3:42 a.m., the Fort Bragg dispatcher received an emergency call. On the line, Jeffrey weakly cried out, "Help! 544 Castle Drive. Stabbing! Hurry!" The operator then heard the sound of the phone dropping. About 10 minutes later, military police arrived at the scene. They found the front door locked and the house dark. When they went around to the back, they noticed the screen door was unlocked and the rear door was open. Upon entering, they were met with a horrifying scene. In the master bedroom, Colette lay on her back, one eye open and one breast exposed. Her body bore the marks of repeated blows from a blunt object, with both arms broken. She had been stabbed 21 times in the chest with an ice pick and 16 times in the neck with a knife. Her trachea was severed in 2 places. Her blood-stained pajamas clung to her, and a paring knife lay beside her. Jeffrey was found lying face down next to her, his head resting on her chest and his arm draped around her neck. He says, "Check my kids. I heard my kids crying." 5-year-old Kimberly was found in her bed. Her head and body had been repeatedly struck with a blunt object, and she had been stabbed 8 to 10 times in the neck. Her skull was fractured, her cheekbone protruding through her skin, and her brain severely bruised, leading to her death shortly after the injuries were inflicted. 2-year-old Kristen lay in her bed with a bottle in her mouth. She had been stabbed 33 times in the chest, neck, hands, and back, and 15 times with an ice pick. Her heart bore 2 knife wounds. On the headboard of the marital bed, the word pig was written in Colette's blood, standing 8 inches tall. After receiving CPR, Jeffrey sat up and shouted, "Oh my God, look at my wife, I'm going to kill those damn acid heads." As he was carried out on a stretcher, he yelled, "Let me see my kids." After receiving treatment at Womack Army Medical Center, the findings of the medical staff deepened the mystery of the case. Although Jeffrey claimed to have engaged in a fierce struggle with 3 male intruders and 1 female intruder, his injuries were far less severe than those of his wife and children. He had some cuts, bruises, and nail scratches on his face and chest, but none of these wounds were life-threatening or required stitches. Additionally, he was diagnosed with a mild concussion and had a stab wound on his right torso, 5/8 of an inch deep, which caused a partial collapse of his lung. Despite this, Jeffrey was discharged from the hospital just 9 days later. During questioning by the Criminal Investigation Division, Jeffrey provided a detailed account of the events, as he claimed they had unfolded. He stated that around 2 a.m. on February 17th, after washing the dinner dishes, he decided to go to bed. Since Kristen had wet his bedside, he took her to his bed and fetched a blanket from her room. He then fell asleep on the living room couch. Later, he was awakened by the screams of Colette and Kimberly. Colette shouted, "Jeffrey! Jeffrey! Help me! Why are they doing this to me?" When he tried to help them, he was attacked by 3 male intruders, 1 black and 2 white men, one of whom wore lightweight gloves, possibly surgical gloves. A 4th intruder, a white woman with long blonde hair, wore knee-high boots with heels, a white floppy hat, and carried a lit candle. She chanted, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." The 3 men attacked him with a club and an ice pick, while the female intruder shouted, "Hit them again." During the struggle, his pajama top was pulled over his head and wrists, and he used the entangled garment to fend off the ice pick thrusts. However, he was eventually overpowered and knocked unconscious at the far end of the living room. When he regained consciousness, the intruders had left the house. He then attempted mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on each of his daughters, but to no avail. Finally, he found Colette, pulled a small paring knife from her chest, threw it to the floor, and tried to find her pulse, but it was futile. He then draped his pajama top over her and called for help. At the time, after receiving Jeffrey's emergency call, the military police immediately launched a search for the 4 intruders. However, they found no suspects matching Jeffrey's description. Investigators also discovered weapons outside the back door, an old hickory kitchen knife, an ice pick, and a 31-inch long piece of wood stained with blood. These items, all from Jeffrey's home, had been wiped clean of fingerprints. Yet, Jeffrey claimed he had never seen these items before. Army investigators quickly grew skeptical of Jeffrey's account, as there was little evidence to support his story. Despite his hand-to-hand combat training, there were almost no signs of a struggle in the living room, aside from an overturned coffee table and a fallen plant. Neighbors also reported hearing no sounds of a struggle or commotion, only Colette's screams. Furthermore, fibers from Jeffrey's torn pajama top were not found in the living room but were discovered beneath Colette's body and in the bedrooms of his 2 daughters. Fibers from the pajamas were also found under Kristen's fingernails, and a fragment of skin was found under Colette's fingernails, though this evidence was later lost. Beneath the headboard where the word pig was written, investigators found the tip of a blood-stained surgical glove, made of materials identical to the medical supplies stored in Jeffrey's home. Jeffrey claimed he had checked on each family member and attempted to rescue them, but no blood or fingerprints were found on either of the 2 phones. He also mentioned that the female intruder's boots were wet, with rainwater dripping from the intruders, but the only footprints at the scene were bare, bloodied footprints in Kristen's bedroom, leading from her bed to the door. By mid-March 1970, the Criminal Investigation Division received forensic test results on blood, hair, and fiber samples from 544 Castle Drive. These results further contradicted Jeffrey's account of his actions, deepening investigators' suspicions. Jeffrey's pajamas. Kimberly's blood was found on his pajamas, despite his claim that he was not wearing them while attempting to rescue her. This suggested he might have been wearing the pajamas during the attack and participated in the violence. Jeffrey's blood His blood was found in significant amounts in only 2 places: in front of a kitchen cabinet containing rubber gloves, and on the right side of the hallway bathroom sink. This indicated he might have engaged in some form of cleanup or concealment after the attack. Colette's blood. Investigators found her blood in Kristen's room, even though all 3 victims were discovered in separate rooms. This suggested Colette might have moved during the attack or that Jeffrey had staged the scene to cover his tracks. Kimberly's blood. Her blood and brain serum were found at the entrance to the master bedroom, indicating she might have entered the room upon hearing the commotion and was then attacked. However, investigators questioned why intruders would bother to take her back to her bedroom to continue the assault. Given that all 4 family members had different blood types, investigators were able to reconstruct the likely sequence of events under the assumption that there were no intruders and that Jeffrey was the perpetrator. The scenario they pieced together is as follows. Jeffrey and Colette likely had an argument in the master bedroom, possibly over Kristen's bedwetting or Jeffrey's infidelity. The argument escalated into a physical altercation, during which Colette may have struck Jeffrey on the forehead with a hairbrush. As the conflict intensified, their eldest daughter, Kimberly, likely heard the commotion and entered the master bedroom. She was then struck on the head, severely injuring her. Jeffrey carried the critically injured Kimberly back to her bedroom and stabbed her. Next, Jeffrey went to Kristen's room, intending to eliminate the last potential witness. However, Colette, regaining consciousness, stumbled into Kristen's bedroom in an attempt to protect her youngest daughter. In the end, Jeffrey killed both of them and carried Colette's body back to the master bedroom. He then put on surgical gloves from the kitchen cabinet, used Colette's blood to write the word "pig" on the headboard, and draped his torn pajama top over her body. He repeatedly stabbed her chest with an ice pick and discarded the weapon near the back door. Finally, Jeffrey retrieved a scalpel from the storage room, went into the bathroom, stood by the sink, and stabbed himself in the chest to create the illusion that he was also a victim. He then used the house phone to call for an ambulance and lay down next to Colette's body to wait for the military police to arrive. Investigators speculated that Jeffrey attempted to frame the crime by drawing inspiration from recent articles he had read about the Manson family murders. The Manson family was a cult led by Charles Manson, whose followers committed a series of violent crimes under his direction. On April 6, 1970, Army investigators formally interrogated Jeffrey, increasingly challenging his account and attempting to uncover the truth through forensic evidence and logical reasoning. At the start of the interrogation, Jeffrey once again detailed his version of events, insisting that he had been attacked by 4 intruders and had engaged in a fierce struggle with them. He described seeing the tops of some boots before losing consciousness and collapsing in the hallway due to a pneumothorax after the intruders left. He also mentioned that he had to convince doctors at the hospital to insert a chest tube because he was certain his lung had been punctured. However, the investigators were unconvinced. They directly confronted Jeffrey. "You didn't do this yourself, did you?" This question clearly struck a nerve, and Jeffrey immediately denied the accusation, attempting to prove his innocence by emphasizing his injuries. The investigators then shifted their focus to the crime scene and the forensic evidence. Jeffrey denied that any of the weapons came from his home, even though the wood found at the scene matched wood from Kimberly's closet. He also claimed he couldn't explain the discrepancies between the fiber and blood evidence and his account. One investigator then posed a critical question. Why were Jeffrey's injuries so much less severe than those of his wife and daughters? He pointed out that if 4 intruders had indeed carried out such a brutal attack, why would they leave Jeffrey, a potential witness, alive? He pressed, "When you were lying in the hallway, why didn't they take that club and hit you once or twice hard on the back of the head and finish you off? Why dish you off? You were face to face with them. They didn't know if you could identify them later. Why leave you alive?" Another investigator noted the lack of chaos and destruction inside the home. If 4 intruders had gone on a killing spree, they would have expected to see evidence such as broken furniture, shattered mirrors, and smashed walls. However, the only signs of a struggle were a top-heavy coffee table and a fallen plant. Jeffrey couldn't provide a reasonable explanation for this observation or for how Kimberly's blood and brain serum had been recovered from the master bedroom. As the interrogation progressed, Jeffrey gradually lost his composure. When the investigators listed more contradictions between his statements and the forensic evidence, he suddenly accused them of having no ideas and trying to frame him to maintain a 100% solve rate. The investigators calmly responded, "We have all these things here that indicate you were involved in this. not some people who came in from the outside, chose 544 Castle Drive, went up there, and luckily found your door open. When asked to take a polygraph test to verify his statements, Jeffrey initially agreed without hesitation. However, within 10 minutes of the interrogation ending, he called the investigators to inform them that he had changed his mind and would not undergo any polygraph testing. This move further deepened the investigators' suspicions of him. On the night of the same day, Jeffrey was relieved of his duties and placed under restrictions pending further investigation. The following day, he was assigned a military lawyer. However, at his mother's suggestion, he hired renowned civilian defense attorney Bernard Siegel on April 10th to represent him. Less than a month later, on May 1st, the Army formally charged Jeffrey with 3 counts of murder. That same day, Jeffrey wrote a letter to Colette's mother and stepfather, insisting on his innocence. In the letter, he emphasized that the Army would never admit their mistakes and speculated that Colette's soul might possess infinite patience and understanding regarding his current legal predicament. On July 6th, under the supervision of Colonel Warren Rock, a preliminary hearing under Article 32 was convened to determine whether there was sufficient evidence to proceed with charges against Jeffrey. The hearing lasted until September, during which Jeffrey's legal team adopted an aggressive strategy, attempting to expose the mistakes and unprofessional conduct of the Army's Criminal Investigation Division during the investigation. Siegel highlighted numerous instances of incompetence by the Criminal Investigation Division, accusing them of clumsily and unprofessionally trampling over the crime scene while examining the house, thereby erasing any potential evidence. He also pointed out that the Criminal Investigation Division had lost critical evidence, including a thread found under Kimberly's fingernails, Jeffrey's pajama pants, 4 torn tips of rubber surgical gloves, and a piece of skin found under one of Colette's fingernails. He further cited several examples of incompetence by the military, police, and first responders, including an ambulance driver who stole Jeffrey's wallet from the living room, and a pathologist who failed to obtain the children's fingerprints from the crime scene for comparison. The first witness to testify in Jeffrey's defense was military police officer Kenneth Mika. He testified that while responding to the emergency call on the night of the murders, he observed a blonde woman wearing a wide-brimmed hat standing at a corner about half a mile from Jeffrey's house. He noted that such a sighting was unusual given the late hour and the weather. He also testified that an ambulance driver at the crime scene had defied instructions by standing up a tilted flower pot. A colonel also testified that he personally visited the crime scene and overturned the coffee table, which hit the side of a rocking chair and came to rest on the edge of the chair. He further noted that if no wet footprints or mud belonging to the alleged intruders were found at the crime scene, it meant that the crime scene investigators had also failed to find any evidence, despite the fact that numerous military, police, and civilians had been walking around the house. In August, a key witness, William Posey, emerged. He claimed that the blonde woman described by Jeffrey might have been a local 17-year-old drug user and police informant named Helena Worrell Stokely. According to him, around 4 a.m. on the day of the murders, Helena was sitting in a car outside her apartment with 2 or 3 young men. He also claimed that Helena stopped wearing boots and floppy hats after February 17th and wore black clothing on the day of the funeral. She even told Posey that she couldn't remember what she had done on the day of the murders. Months later, Helena allegedly told Posey that she and her boyfriend couldn't get married until they went out and killed more people. Although Helena was located and questioned by the police, her responses were vague and contradictory. She recalled that on the night of February 16th, she had gone out for a drive with her boyfriend, Gregory Mitchell, in the early hours of the next morning, driving aimlessly. However, she claimed to have been under the influence of a hallucinogen to the extent that she couldn't be sure whether she had been at Jeffrey's house. Despite witnesses claiming that she had admitted to being involved in the murders and that her clothing on that day matched Jeffrey's description, she was not called to testify. During the hearing, Jeffrey testified for 3 days, and parts of his testimony contradicted what he had told investigators on April 6th. For example, he now claimed that he had actually moved Colette's body, finding her somewhat leaning against a chair, and then simply laid her flat on the floor. He also stated that, possibly due to his surgical background, he had rinsed his hands a bit in the bathroom while checking his injuries before seeking help. He further mentioned the type B blood found in the kitchen, testifying that he might have also washed his hands in the kitchen sink for some reason before calling emergency services. Additionally, Jeffrey said that on February 17th or 18th, he discovered 2 lumps on the back of his head, 2 or 3 puncture wounds on his upper left chest, other wounds on his right bicep, and about 10 ice pick wounds on his abdomen. However, none of these wounds were treated and none required surgery. This account contradicted medical reports and his previous descriptions. When questioned about his infidelity, Jeffrey admitted to 2 affairs but insisted that Colette had been unaware of both. He also claimed that their time at Fort Bragg had been the most fulfilling period of their marriage. Following Jeffrey's testimony, a clinical psychologist testified about the conclusions he had drawn from a series of tests he had conducted on Jeffrey. The expert noted that the tests revealed an abnormal lack of anxiety, depression, and anger in Jeffrey regarding the loss of his family. His report concluded that Jeffrey was capable of amassing a significant amount of denial or repression, to the point that the impact of recent events on his life had diminished. Furthermore, such an extreme psychological response could lead a person to portray themselves as both a victim and a martyr. On October 13th, the colonel issued a report recommending that the charges against Jeffrey be dismissed due to insufficient evidence to prove his guilt. He also noted that the nature of the murders led him to believe that the perpetrator was either mentally disturbed or under the influence of drugs. He recommended that civilian authorities further investigate Helena. Later that month, all charges were formally dismissed, although a new Criminal Investigation Division investigative team formed in February 1971 continued to search for the killer, with Jeffrey still considered a suspect. In December, Jeffrey was honorably discharged from the Army and returned to New York City. In July 1971, he moved to Long Beach, California, attempting to leave the past behind and distance himself from the memories of his deceased wife and daughters. He secured a job as an emergency room physician at St. Mary Medical Center and became a lecturer at the UCLA School of Medicine, the medical director of the Long Beach Grand Prix, and a speaker on topics related to identifying and treating child abuse. He also contributed to the development of the National Cardiopulmonary Resuscitation Training Program. Living in a $350,000 apartment in Huntington Beach, he led a promiscuous lifestyle until the late 1970s, when he entered a long-term relationship with a 22-year-old flight attendant named Candy Kramer. In the years following the dismissal of the murder charges, Jeffrey garnered significant emotional and public support. He also wrote to several magazines and newspapers, detailing his willingness to further publicize the background and legitimacy of his case. On December 15, 1970, he appeared on The Dick Cavett Show, complaining about the Army's investigation and their focus on him as a suspect, which he portrayed as reckless. During this appearance, he claimed to have sustained 23 injuries, some of which he described as potentially fatal. Jeffrey's stepfather, Alfred Kasab, initially believed in his son-in-law's innocence and testified in support of Jeffrey during the Army's Article 32 hearing alongside Colette's mother. However, by November 1970, Kasab grew suspicious due to Jeffrey's repeated unwillingness to provide him with a copy of the 2,000-page transcript from the hearing. Jeffrey deceived him by claiming that he and some Army colleagues had actually tracked down, tortured, and ultimately murdered one of the 4 alleged killers. Kasab's doubts intensified after Jeffrey's casual and dismissive demeanor on the Dick Cavett Show. He and his wife publicly turned against Jeffrey and began dedicating themselves to bringing him to justice. In February 1971, Kasab successfully obtained a copy of the Article 32 hearing records from the Army. After meticulously studying the documents, he realized that Jeffrey's account was inconsistent with the physical evidence and concluded that his narrative was nothing more than a web of lies, repeatedly contradicting the known facts of the case. Kasab also discovered that Jeffrey had begun dating a young woman employed at Fort Bragg just weeks after his family's murder and had rekindled a relationship with another woman. Collaborating with Colonel Krivenek and other Army investigators, Kasab visited the crime scene to compare the physical evidence with Jeffrey's testimony. This assessment ultimately convinced him of Jeffrey's guilt, and he resolved to dedicate his life to pursuing all legal avenues to bring Jeffrey to justice. In early 1972, Kasab filed a citizen's complaint with the U.S. Department of Justice, requesting the convening of a grand jury to indict Jeffrey for murder. However, since the murders occurred while Jeffrey was serving in the military and he had already been discharged, the complaint was declared moot. The FBI declined to take up the case. On April 30, 1974, Kasab, along with their attorney Richard Kahn and Criminal Investigation Division agent Peter Kearns, submitted a citizen's complaint to the Chief Judge of the U.S. District Court, requesting the convening of a grand jury to indict Jeffrey for murder. A month later, Justice Department prosecutors ruled that the case warranted prosecution. On August 12th, a grand jury convened before a U.S. District Judge in Raleigh, North Carolina, to hear the legal proceedings. 75 witnesses were called to testify, with Jeffrey being the first to take the stand. His testimony lasted 5 days, during which he admitted that, despite his public declaration after the 1970 dismissal of the murder charges to pursue all legal avenues and hire investigators, he had not actually done so. Nevertheless, he insisted that he had made efforts to identify the perpetrators and locate Helena. He also claimed that the fabricated information he provided to Kassab and certain media outlets was intended to placate his in-laws, and that he had sustained more stab and puncture wounds than were recorded in contemporary medical records. When prosecutors asked if he would submit to a polygraph or sodium amytal test to verify his account of events, Jeffrey read a statement prepared by his attorney, refusing the request. A surgeon testified that, aside from the lung injury, Jeffrey's other wounds were minor and would not have impaired his physical abilities. A psychiatrist testified that he found Jeffrey to be an extremely controlling individual, deeply reliant on others' perceptions of him. A chief of the chemistry division testified that Colette's pajamas had been heavily bloodstained before being torn, and that the tearing had occurred while the fabric was stationary, contradicting Jeffrey's claim that the pajamas were torn during a struggle against the attackers. On January 21, 1975, Jeffrey was recalled to testify before the grand jury. This time, when questioned about his infidelity or the forensic contradictions between his account and the physical evidence presented by the prosecution, he displayed noticeable arrogance and sarcasm. At one point, he shouted, "I don't know. I don't even know what nonsense you're trying to feed me." He also refused to discuss the results of a private polygraph test he had agreed to in 1970, the results of which had been handed over to his attorney, indicating that he needed to consult his lawyer before agreeing to this line of inquiry. After a brief recess, Jeffrey read a statement prepared by his attorney, denying the prosecution's request to discuss the results of his 1970 polygraph examination, arguing that it violated attorney-client privilege. He then addressed the jury directly, stating that 5 long years had passed since his family's murder and his efforts to rebuild his life, and that the questions posed by the prosecution were ones he had endured for those 5 years. On January 24th, the grand jury formally indicted Jeffrey on 3 counts of murder. Less than an hour later, he was arrested in California. On January 31st, his friends and colleagues raised $100,000 in bail to secure his release while awaiting the resolution of the charges. Although he was arraigned on May 23rd and pleaded not guilty to the murder charges, the legal proceedings were fraught with complications. On July 29th, the judge dismissed the defense's arguments regarding double jeopardy and the right to a speedy trial, allowing the trial date originally set for August 18, 1975 to proceed. However, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled on August 15th to stay the proceedings, holding that the defendant was entitled to a speedy trial by January 23, 1976, and therefore ordered the indictment dismissed. Upon hearing this news, Jeffrey shed tears of relief, believing his ordeal was over. However, the government appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which on May 1, 1978, ruled that the Fourth Circuit had erred in dismissing the indictment on speedy trial grounds before the case had been tried. This decision allowed the case to proceed. Kassab welcomed this development, stating, "It's been a tremendous personal pressure knowing someone is running around who you are convinced killed your daughter and grandchildren." On July 16, 1979, Jeffrey stood trial in Raleigh, North Carolina, charged with 3 counts of murder. Judge Dupree presided over the trial, and Jeffrey pleaded not guilty to the charges. Although his attorneys were confident of an acquittal, a series of rulings during the trial worked against the defense. First, the judge refused to admit a 1979 psychiatric evaluation of Jeffrey as evidence, which suggested that someone with his personality and mindset was highly unlikely to have killed his family. The judge ruled that since his attorneys had not entered an insanity plea, he did not want the trial bogged down by conflicting psychiatric testimony from prosecution and defense witnesses. Second, the judge denied the defense's motion to exclude Jeffrey's pajamas as evidence, a significant blow to the defense as the bloodstains and fibers on the pajamas were among the prosecution's key pieces of evidence. On the first day of the trial, the judge allowed the prosecution to introduce as evidence the March 1970 issue of Esquire magazine found in Jeffrey's home, which contained a lengthy article about the Manson family murders. This evidence was intended to suggest that Jeffrey might have mimicked the Manson family's methods. However, the judge also denied the prosecution's request to introduce any part of the Article 32 transcript from Jeffrey's 1970 military hearing, ruling that since the current trial was a civilian one, and the Article 32 hearing included reports from military investigators suggesting Jeffrey had murdered his family in a drug-induced rage, such evidence was also prejudicial. On July 19th, Jeffrey's trial entered a critical phase, as both the prosecution and defense delivered their opening statements to the jury. The prosecution outlined its burden of proof in establishing Jeffrey's guilt, emphasizing that the murders were committed with malice. The prosecutor pointed out that the prosecution would prove Jeffrey's guilt through physical evidence and circumstantial evidence, urging jurors to listen to the testimony, examine the evidence presented, and draw their own conclusions. He concluded by stating, "We believe the physical evidence points to the fact that one person, not 2, 3, 4, or more, killed Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen. That person is the defendant." Throughout the trial, the prosecution's evidence and witness testimonies were more compelling, while the defense faced several unfavorable rulings. Despite this, the defense argued that the crime scene had been hopelessly compromised during the investigation, with potential evidence either destroyed, lost, or never collected. The defense also called a key witness, Helena, attempting to use her testimony to prove she was one of the intruders Jeffrey had described. However, Helena denied any involvement in the murders or knowledge of who might have committed them, stating she did not want to be a scapegoat. On August 23rd and 24th, Jeffrey took the stand as the final defense witness. His testimony was a pivotal moment in the trial, with both sides attempting to sway the jury through his statements. He first underwent questioning by his defense attorney, who sought to humanize Jeffrey in the eyes of the jury by having him describe his family, background, and lifestyle. Jeffrey then detailed the personalities of each family member, describing the family as close-knit. "We shared almost everything. We were all friends. Colette and I shared the process of raising our children. We shared our life experiences." He also claimed that the reason he had never remarried was that he could not forget his wife and children, thinking of them every day. He recounted his life in the years following their deaths, explaining that his decision to move to California was to distance himself from well-meaning people. He insisted that working up to 80 hours a week was easier than sitting and thinking about his family. He also presented several family photos and artifacts, attempting to evoke sympathy from the jury for his family life. The following day, the prosecution cross-examined Jeffrey. The prosecutor systematically listed the physical and circumstantial evidence from the crime scene, which contradicted Jeffrey's account of intruders attacking him and murdering his family, instead pointing to his own guilt. He often began each question with a phrase along the lines of, "Dr. MacDonald, if the jury finds from the evidence that..." On August 28th, both sides delivered their closing arguments to the jury. The prosecution went first, contrasting the injuries suffered by Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen with those sustained by Jeffrey, noting that Jeffrey's only serious injury was the pneumothorax wound to his chest. The prosecutor referenced Jeffrey's claim of a life-and-death struggle with the alleged intruders, but the evidence suggested the struggle occurred between a white male and a white female, the female being Colette and the male being Jeffrey. He then dismissed the character witnesses who had earlier testified that Jeffrey was a good husband and father, returning to the evidence. "If we convince you with the evidence that he did it, we don't have to prove he's the kind of person who could do this." He concluded his argument by stating, "I can only tell you from the physical evidence that things don't lie, but people can and do lie." The defense also delivered its closing argument, portraying Jeffrey as a loving husband and father and emphasizing that Jeffrey had consistently maintained that 4 intruders were responsible for the murders. They criticized the prosecution's case as a house built on sand and urged the jury to grant Jeffrey the peace he had sought for nearly a decade. In his final instructions to the jury, the judge informed them they had 3 options: to find Jeffrey not guilty, to find him guilty of first-degree murder, or to find him guilty of second-degree murder in each case. Shortly after 4 p.m. on August 29, 1979, the jury returned its verdict after 6.5 hours of deliberation. Jeffrey was convicted of 1 count of first-degree murder in the death of Kristen and 2 counts of second-degree murder in the deaths of Colette and Kimberly. Following the verdict, Kassab immediately called the family's attorney, thanking him for his years of relentless effort. He said, "Hi, Dick. I just got what I wanted, 3 life sentences. Thank you for everything you've done. We couldn't have done it without your help." Kassab and his wife also told the media, "This had to be done. Now we can rest." After 1980, there were several legal dramas, including instances where Jeffrey's convictions were overturned, only to be reinstated later. On February 23, 1970, Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen were laid to rest side by side at Washington Memorial Park in Suffolk County, Long Island. Each grave initially bore the MacDonald surname, which was later changed to Colette's maiden name, Stevenson. Jeffrey is currently serving a life sentence at a federal prison in Cumberland, Maryland. Despite having spent decades behind bars, he continues to maintain his innocence. Some of his supporters believe in his claims of innocence, viewing him as a potential victim of a miscarriage of justice. Jeffrey himself has never ceased his efforts to defend himself, continuing to seek exoneration through legal avenues. He has stated, "I won't come out and lie to the parole board just to make them let me rest. If I have to tell the parole board I killed my family to get out of here and go home, then I'll never go home." In the dark chapters of human history, there always emerge some chilling figures. Cloaked in human skin, they are monsters devoid of morality and legal constraints, pushing the boundaries of evil to the extreme as serial killers. Westley Allan Dodd, a convicted American serial killer, is one such individual. Parks, libraries, and movie theaters, places that should be havens for children's joyful growth, became his hunting grounds. His targets were the most innocent group, naive and unsuspecting young boys. He disguised himself as a friendly adult, exploiting children's trust, using candies and toys as bait to lure them to secluded corners. There, he satisfied his twisted desires through sexual assault, then brutally ended the children's lives with a cold blade. His diary was filled with morbid fantasies and violent desires. Not only did he record his crimes, but he also attempted to warn parents on how to protect their children from sexual assault through a pamphlet, posing as an expert. Before his execution, he claimed to have found God and expressed so-called apologies to his victims. He said, "I believe in the teachings of the Bible. I will go to heaven, although I have doubts about it, but I really want to believe that I can find those 3 little boys, give them a hug, and tell them how sorry I am. I wish to love them with true love and not harm them in any way." But no matter what he said, it couldn't change the fact that he was a criminal or make the families he hurt feel better. On Monday, July 3, 1961, Westley was born in Toppenish, Yakima County, Washington. This small city, located in the Yakima Valley, is notorious for its high crime rates, particularly violent and property crimes, and has a population predominantly composed of Native Americans and ethnic minorities. Westley's family environment was fraught with tension and violence. His parents had an extremely hostile relationship, frequently engaging in fierce arguments and even physical altercations. On one occasion, his father injured his mother's eye during a quarrel, leaving Westley, the eldest son, and his brother to tremble as they witnessed the scene. If they attempted to intervene, their father would punish them with a belt. Westley never heard any affectionate words from his parents, such as, "I love you." This emotional void left him feeling lonely and neglected. When Westley was arrested for murder, his father admitted to being overly strict in disciplining his children, while his mother expressed shock and anguish over his crimes, denying any lack of a positive family atmosphere. However, in 2016, their other son was arrested for attempting to sexually abuse a 13-year-old girl, further exposing the severe issues in the family's upbringing and socialization. During Westley's formative years, he preferred contact with boys his own age over girls. At the age of 9, he showed a preference for boys, and this tendency became more pronounced at the age of 13, when he began contacting boys in the neighborhood and displaying some unusual behavior. His father noticed the behavior and inquired about it with a local newspaper and learned that it could be homosexual-like behavior. However, the father chose to ignore the warning, believing Westley to be a well-behaved child who had never had a problem with drugs, alcohol, or tobacco. On July 3, 1976, his 15th birthday, a day that should have been filled with blessings and celebration, became the starting point of his family's disintegration. On this day, his parents erupted into a fierce argument. Due to long-standing relationship issues, his mother decided to file for divorce. This news caused his father to emotionally collapse, even attempting suicide. As a result, Westley received no birthday wishes. Instead, he was shadowed by the family's breakdown in his father's suicide attempt. After the divorce, Westley and his brother moved with their mother to Vancouver, Washington. Despite living with his mother, he still felt a lack of love and support at home. After his arrest, he repeatedly mentioned his mother's coldness and her inability to provide emotional care. Although they moved to Vancouver, Westley continued to attend Richland High School, a public school where he was unpopular. No social groups were willing to accept him, and no one wanted to befriend him. This isolation stemmed from his early tendencies toward animal abuse and child harassment, as well as a strong interest in violence and control. During high school, his criminal behavior gradually escalated. He began molesting children, starting with his cousin and then sexually harassing neighborhood children. He was also arrested for indecent exposure and lewd conduct, but because he was a minor, the police could only release him and recommend juvenile psychological counseling. However, this lenient handling did not deter his criminal behavior. Instead, it made him more brazen. In August 1981, 20-year-old Westley attempted to kidnap 2 girls in Vancouver. Fortunately, the girls quickly sensed the danger and escaped. They reported the incident to the local police, providing detailed descriptions of the perpetrator's appearance, behavior, and his attempt to lure them. However, the police took no substantive action against Westley. No arrest, no in-depth investigation into his background or behavioral patterns. The following month, Westley enlisted in the U.S. Navy and was assigned to the submarine base in Bangor, Washington. During this time, his behavior spiraled out of control. He began targeting children living near the base, exploiting his military status and relatively free movement to find opportunities to approach and abuse these children. In one incident, Westley offered a group of boys $50 to accompany him to a motel room to play strip poker. This proposal alarmed the boys, who reported Westley's behavior to the police. During interrogation, Westley unabashedly admitted that he had indeed planned to molest the boys. Incredibly, he was eventually released without facing any formal charges. Shortly afterward, Westley was arrested again for exposing himself to a boy. This time, his behavior drew the attention of the military. The Navy conducted an internal investigation and decided to discharge him dishonorably. Despite being expelled from the Navy, Westley was only sentenced to 19 days in jail and required to undergo court-ordered psychological counseling. However, these lenient punishments did not stop his criminal activities. Westley's life was almost entirely centered around planning how to approach and exploit children. Every step he took was meticulously designed to ensure he could easily access potential victims. To achieve this sinister goal, he chose to move into an apartment building inhabited by multiple families with children. Additionally, he took on jobs such as a charity truck driver, which not only allowed him freedom of movement, but also provided him with convenient access to vulnerable groups in the community. In the apartment building, Westley repeatedly molested his neighbor's preschool-aged children. Although these actions were discovered by the children's mother, she refused to file formal charges with the police out of concern for the psychological trauma it might cause her child. By 1987, Westley's behavior had become even more brazen. He attempted to lure a young boy into an empty building, clearly intending to commit further acts of abuse. However, the boy displayed remarkable alertness, refused Westley's invitation, and reported the incident to the police. The police subsequently intervened, and upon learning of Westley's long history of sexual offenses, the prosecutor recommended a 5-year prison sentence. However, since Westley had not actually committed a crime in this particular incident, the court once again handed down a lenient sentence. Ultimately, he was only given probation and ordered to undergo psychiatric treatment. Once the probation period ended, Westley immediately stopped treatment and moved to Vancouver, Washington. There, he found a job as a transportation clerk, which not only provided him with a stable income, but also allowed him to continue moving freely within the community, searching for new targets. In the early autumn of 1989, he set his sights on David Douglas Park in Vancouver. Known for its dense trees, winding paths, and relatively secluded environment, the park became an ideal location in his eyes for finding potential victims. Over the next few years, Westley was arrested multiple times for child molestation, but each time he was sentenced to short-term imprisonment and court-mandated treatment. These brief punishments and superficial treatments failed to curb his criminal behavior. On the contrary, his desires and violent tendencies grew stronger, eventually escalating into even more horrifying crimes. Westley's total number of victims amounted to approximately 50, all under the age of 12, with some as young as 2 years old. Most of them were boys, innocent, unsuspecting children who became victims of his twisted desires. Over time, Westley's sexual fantasies became increasingly violent. He later stated during interrogation, "The more I thought about it, the more exciting the idea of murder sounded. I planned many ways to kill a boy." A psychiatric doctor pointed out that Westley met the legal criteria for a sexual psychopath. His actions were not merely driven by sexual impulses but were accompanied by an extreme craving for violence and control. This psychological state left him utterly devoid of compassion for children's lives, even viewing murder as an exhilarating act. On September 4, 1989, Westley entered the park carrying a sharp fillet knife and several shoelaces. His goal was clear: to find a young boy and carry out the murder he had repeatedly rehearsed in his mind. At the time, the park was filled with the laughter and playful noises of children, while Westley, like a lurking predator, calmly observed his surroundings. Soon his gaze locked on to 11-year-old Cole Nair and his 10-year-old brother William Nair, who were playing in the park, completely unaware of the danger approaching. Westley approached them with a friendly demeanor, using lies and deceit to lure them to a secluded corner, far from the sight of others. There, Westley forced the two brothers to undress and tied them to a tree with the shoelaces he had brought. He then sexually assaulted both children, the entire process filled with violence and control. After the assault, his violent actions did not stop. He took out the fillet knife and repeatedly stabbed Cole and William until they collapsed in a pool of blood. Then he fled the scene, leaving the two children in the woods. Shortly after, other park visitors discovered Cole and William. Cole was found dead at the scene, while William tragically passed away on the way to the nearby hospital. However, Westley did not stop his depraved actions. After the murders, he created a scrapbook containing news articles and clippings about the case. This scrapbook not only documented his crimes, but also served as a tool to satisfy his twisted psyche. On October 29th, Westley drove to Portland, Oregon, where he encountered 4-year-old Lee Isali and his 9-year-old brother Justin playing in a local park. Lee was sliding up and down on a slide while Justin watched nearby. Westley approached them with a friendly demeanor and successfully convinced Lee to play with him using lies. Justin was preparing to go home, and Westley told Lee that he would drive him home. The naive Lee believed him and got into his car without suspicion. He took Lee to his apartment in Vancouver without drawing any attention along the way. Once inside the apartment, he ordered Lee to undress, tied him to the bed with rope, and sexually assaulted him. Not only did he abuse Lee, but he also photographed the entire process, as if these images were trophies of his twisted desires. Then Lee was forced to spend the night in his apartment, during which Westley continued to abuse him while meticulously documenting every detail in his diary. The next morning, Westley strangled Lee with a rope and hung his body in a closet, taking photographs of it. These photos became part of his collection, a grim record of his complete disregard for life. Westley later admitted to the police that he had not initially intended to kill Lee, but felt compelled to do so to prevent the boy from becoming a witness to his crimes. To cover up his actions, Westley stuffed Lee's body into a garbage bag and discarded it in the bush near Vancouver Lake. For the following month, Westley kept a low profile, spending most of his time in his apartment. He wrote down plans for future child abductions and even constructed a homemade torture rack for his next victim. On November 13th, Westley's criminal activities came to the end. That day, he drove to Camas, Washington, a small town about 12 miles east of Vancouver. His target was a 6-year-old boy, James Kirk II, at a local theater. As usual, he attempted to lure the boy away from the theater. However, this time, his plan did not go as expected. When he tried to carry James out of the theater lobby, the boy began to struggle violently and cried out loudly. His cries caught the attention of theater staff, who quickly became suspicious of Westley. Faced with their pursuit, Westley had no choice but to release James and hurriedly fled to his car in an attempt to escape. Meanwhile, James's mother's boyfriend, William Graves, arrived at the theater. Upon being informed that the boy had nearly been abducted, he immediately left the theater and chased after Westley. He soon spotted Wesley's car, which had broken down on the side of the road due to engine trouble. To avoid alerting the kidnapper and to buy time, Graves pretended to be a helpful passerby and offered to assist with the car repairs. The moment Westley let his guard down, Graves swiftly subdued him and brought him back to the theater, where staff called the police. The Camas police arrived promptly at the scene. During the investigation, the Camas police quickly realized that Westley might be connected to the murder of Lee Isali, which the Portland police were investigating. They contacted the Portland Police Task Force and took Westley to the Camas police station for initial questioning. He was then transferred to the Clark County Jail in Vancouver, where Portland detectives interrogated him for 3 days. Under pressure, Westley eventually confessed to all 3 murders, the deaths of Cole, William, and Lee. With his confession, the police swiftly searched Westley's residence. In his apartment, they discovered chilling evidence: a homemade torture rack, newspaper clippings about his crimes, a briefcase containing Lee's underwear, a photo album with pictures of Lee, and various advertisements for children's underwear cut from newspapers and store catalogs. Additionally, the police found Westley's diary, in which he detailed the events of each murder, his psychological state, and his plans for future crimes. Westley was formally charged with aggravated first-degree murder in the deaths of Cole, William, and Lee, as well as the attempted kidnapping of another child. During his trial at the Clark County Superior Court, the prosecution read excerpts from his diary and presented photos of Lee's captivity to the jury, revealing the brutal details of his crimes. However, the defense called no witnesses and presented no evidence, arguing only that he was legally insane. Ultimately, the jury found Westley guilty and agreed with the prosecutor's request for the death penalty. Throughout the trial, Westley remained eerily calm. He claimed that defending himself was pointless and criticized the U.S. judicial system as a failure. In 1990, Westley was formally sentenced to death for the murders of Cole and William, as well as the rape and murder of Lee. Under Washington state law, Westley had the option to choose between lethal injection or hanging. He chose hanging, stating that he wanted to end his life in the same manner he had taken Lee's. His choice of execution method sparked some controversy. The American Civil Liberties Union filed a lawsuit, arguing that hanging violated the Eighth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Although the case reached the Washington Supreme Court, it did not halt Westley's execution, primarily because he himself had chosen hanging. Less than 4 years passed between Westley's conviction and his execution. He refused to appeal his case or the death sentence, insisting that he could not control his impulses and would kill again if released. In a court brief, he stated, "I must be executed before I have a chance to escape or kill someone else. If I do escape, I promise you I will kill and rape again, and I will enjoy every minute of it." He also claimed that death would free him from the guilt of his murders. While awaiting execution, Westley wrote a pamphlet advising parents on how to protect their children from predators like himself, a deeply ironic act, as if he were attempting to justify his crimes in some way. At 12:05 a.m. on January 5, 1993, Westley was executed by hanging at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. This marked the first hanging in the United States since George York and James Latham were executed in Kansas in 1965. On the day of the execution, a crowd gathered outside the prison, with some supporting the execution and others protesting the death penalty. The media extensively covered the event, even detailing the history of hanging, the sound of the trapdoor, the type of rope used, and how the rope was prepared for optimal effect. For the last meal, Westley requested grilled salmon and fried potatoes. Standing on the gallows' second floor, he delivered his final words. "Someone once asked me, I don't remember who, if there was any way to stop sex offenders. I said no, but I was wrong. I said there is no hope, no peace, but I was wrong. Hope exists. Peace is here. I have found both in the Lord Jesus Christ. Look to the Lord, and you will find peace." Then 12 local and regional media members, prison officials, and family members of the 3 victims witnessed the execution. After being pronounced dead by the prison doctor, Westley's body was transported to Seattle for an autopsy. The King County medical examiner found that he had died quickly within 2 to 3 minutes, but not from a broken neck. Following the autopsy, his body was cremated, and the ashes were given to his family. One serial killer is mostly remembered for 2 strange fetishes. Not only did he have a necrophilia, but he was also morbidly fascinated by women's shoes. Back in the late 1960s, Jerome Henry Brudos had a horrific murder spree in the Salem, Oregon area. He picked on petite, fragile-looking women, and the tortures he inflicted on the kidnapped or trapped women were horrifying. They would be strangled and beaten to death with blunt objects, and even after they were already dead, he would not leave them alone. Jerome would cut off their body parts as his trophies and dump those women in the local rivers. It's crazy how messed up Jerome is. In some cases, he even goes as far as to abduct and assault his victims while wearing women's clothing. Even after he was arrested, he didn't feel remorse for his crimes. Instead, he felt bad about getting caught. In one interview, a detective asked him, "Do you have any regrets? Do you feel sorry for the girls who died?" He just picked up a piece of paper, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it on the floor, saying, "I cared as much for those girls as I do for this ball of paper." Jerome was born in a hospital in Webster, South Dakota on January 31, 1939, to a family that lived a simple and modest life. His father usually did temporary jobs and his mother was a housewife. He had a rough childhood. His mom was a strict person and he lacked love and approval. His mom wanted her second child to be a girl, but Jerome was a boy. She made no secret of her dislike for the youngest son, reserving most of her resentment and criticism for him. Jerome grew up with a close friendship with a female neighbor who was a little older than his mom. She was kind and showed him compassion and acceptance throughout the relationship, which helped him a lot. Jerome often imagined that this neighbor was his real mom. Unfortunately, this neighbor was diabetic, and as her health got worse, they stopped seeing each other. The real pain for this poor child was when he was saved by someone, but that person disappeared again. Jerome was obsessed with women's shoes and feet, but no one knew why. One time, when Jerome was 5, a teenage girl fell asleep in his bed and he couldn't stop staring at her high heels. He tried to take her shoes off and she got scared. Instead of yelling at him, she just told him to leave the room. Another time, Jerome found a pair of leather high heels with rhinestone inlays while exploring the local dump. He brought the shoes home and showed them to his mom in the heels and women's clothing, but his mom was disgusted and screamed for him to lose the heels, then beat him severely and burned the clothes. When he was 7 years old, he tried to steal his teacher's high heels, and when he was caught, he admitted to the theft but did not explain why he did it. Because of Jerome's dad's job, they moved around a lot. Eventually, they moved to Salem, Oregon, where Jerome was about 12 years old and well into puberty. But he hadn't changed at all, and he even developed a fetish for women's underwear. Jerome said a neighborhood boy took him to touch and smell some girl's underwear, and that's why he did it. Women's shoes and lingerie had already turned Jerome on, but his height and severe acne made him very self-conscious and shy around women. At 14, he started masturbating to porn mags and often had dreams about women. When his mom found semen stains on his bed, he was punished and forced to wash the sheets. At 15, he started stalking young women in the area, taking quiet photos of several of them, and stealing and keeping many of the women's undergarments and shoes. Although none of these offenses were violent, it's clear that he developed violent fantasies of forcibly possessing women at this time. When he was 16, he started acting weird. He dug a tunnel under his house and made a little room in it. He did this because he had some kinky ideas about catching women, even though he didn't really keep anyone there. That is, until Jerome came up with a pattern of crime. He'd lure a neighbor girl into his bedroom under one pretext and then find an excuse to leave the room. A few minutes later, a masked, knife-wielding man forced the girl to strip naked and he took a bunch of pictures of her before running off. Then, a short time later, Jerome came back wearing a shirt with his hair a mess and a cut on his cheek. He told the girl that an intruder had locked him in the family barn with a knife. In the year after that, Jerome did it again and again, hurting a bunch of girls, but because they weren't physically or sexually assaulted and went into Jerome's bedroom on their own, no one told the police about it at the time. In April 1956, he persuaded a 17-year-old girl to accompany him on a date, and after driving her down a deserted road, he then ordered the girl to take off her clothes. But the girl refused, so infuriated, he dragged the girl out of the car and broke her nose. But luckily, the girl's screams caught the attention of a young couple driving by who stopped Jerome's behavior. The girl was hysterical that Jerome was trying to sexually assault her, and he lamely explained that the girl had accidentally fallen out of the car, and then went on to say that there was a strange weirdo who was trying to sexually assault the girl, and that he was just coming over to help. But there was clearly no credibility to the story, so the couple took them to a nearby police station. Once in the interrogation room, Jerome became very compliant and admitted to assaulting the girl, but his intent was only to get her to take off her clothes and take pictures of her, denying that he had done this type of behavior before. Jerome was arrested for assault and battery. Then the police found out during a search of his bedroom that Jerome had a large collection of women's clothing as well as a large number of real photographs taken of nude girls. The police contacted one of the girls and asked her why she had been photographed in these pictures. The girl revealed everything that had happened last year. And it was at this point that the police realized that this was not his first-time offender and that he had already harmed. More than one woman had been harmed. And because those girls were too young to tell their parents and the police about such things, nothing like this had happened. Then, Jerome was sent to the Polk County Juvenile Hall, where he was treated as a juvenile delinquent and sent to the Oregon State Hospital for a psychiatric evaluation on April 16, 1956. He stayed there for a total of 9 months. He underwent a series of psychiatric evaluations, and the tests concluded that Jerome was a depressed person suffering from schizotypal personality disorder. Psychologists also concluded that his sexual fantasies stemmed solely from his hatred of his mother. After Jerome got out of the hospital, he went back to living with his parents and graduated from Corvallis High School like a normal student in 1957. 2 years later, he joined the army and trained as a communications technician. His comrades remembered him as a guy who only fantasized because he said he could have casual sex with a Korean girl and that the girl would quietly come to his bed every night. In October 1959, he was expelled from the army because he had been tested and found psychologically unfit for military service. Jerome went back to his parents' place and got a job as an electrical engineer at a local radio station. His coworkers saw him as an outstanding, skilled, and dedicated employee with a mild-mannered demeanor. But even though he was a licensed technician, he didn't seem to have any idea of advancing his abilities. At this time, although Jerome had a good job, his mother did not change her mind in the least. She loathed Jerome and doted on her other son, and during the years he lived with his parents, he was allowed to sleep in his bedroom. But whenever his older brother came home, he was forced to sleep in a makeshift shed he had created at the back of the house. Around 1960, he kept up his stalking behavior. One time, Jerome saw a young woman dressed in revealing clothing, and he followed her to an apartment. In a dark stairwell, he covered the girl's mouth, and after a few minutes of struggling, she fell into a coma. He didn't sexually assault or beat her, just took the girl's shoes and ran away. On another occasion, Jerome saw another beautiful girl in high heels, and he tried to take the girl's shoes, as he had done on the previous occasion. However, the girl fought back, and he panicked and fled after getting only one of the heels. After about a year of working at a radio station in Corvallis, Jerome got to know a 17-year-old girl named Ralphine Schwindler. He met Schwindler through a teenage boy who was into electronics and often went to the radio station to watch and ask about Jerome's work. One day, Jerome said he wanted to find a girlfriend, and the boy agreed right away and took him to Schwindler's house. They got married on September 30th, 1961, when Schwindler was a month pregnant. At first, they lived in Portland, Oregon, and then in the summer of 1968, they moved to a small house in a suburb of Salem. They had 2 kids together, and Jerome sometimes helped repair vehicles in the family garage to make some extra money. He actually never mistreated his wife, but for the first few years of their marriage, he insisted that Schwindler walk around the house naked and do her chores in the same way. For several years, Schwindler went along with these strange habits until the mid-1960s, when Jerome's daughter was a toddler, and she rejected his strange habits to make sure her child developed properly. Jerome gained weight, and she said that even though she never told him, she was starting to be disgusted by how he was looking. She was still faithful to him, but they were interacting less and less. She was spending more time with her daughter and her female friends, and Jerome was spending more time working on the house or in his garage workshop. In May 1967, while Schwindler was in the hospital with her second child, Jerome followed a young woman in high heels to her home. He waited until nightfall, then went into her apartment and strangled the girl. He later said that when he first went into the house, he didn't plan to rape the girl, but seeing her lying there all pretty and vulnerable turned him on so much that he sexually assaulted her. Then, he took her high heels and left. The next year, he was arrested by Corvallis police on the grounds of the women's dorm at Oregon State University. He was charged with stealing women's clothing, and he was arrested by the police while still wearing high heels and women's underwear. Between 1968 and 1969, Jerome kidnapped and killed at least 4 young women and attempted to kidnap at least 2 others. After each victim was abducted, he would ask them to wear different underwear and shoes, and then he would take his camera and photograph the women. Linda Catherine Slauson, the first known victim, was from Aloha, Oregon. She was only 19 years old when she was murdered by Jerome. She was a saleswoman selling encyclopedias and had high hopes for the future. On January 26, 1968, Linda went to Jerome's yard. She talked to Jerome, who was working in the yard. She wanted to sell the encyclopedia she had with her. Jerome was acting normal. He invited Linda into the room and said he wanted to look over the encyclopedia with her, because there would be extra money for each copy sold, so Linda agreed to go into the room with him. As Linda sat on a stool and started her sales pitch, Jerome took out a wooden club and hit her in the head. Then he strangled her with his hands before dragging Linda's body to the basement of the house. He got his family to go out with his daughter to get burgers, cleaned up the blood, and then went down to the basement to get rid of Linda's body. He eagerly removed Linda's clothes and noticed her red lingerie, which aroused his desire. He repeatedly engaged in necrophilia, dressed Linda's body in different shoes and lingerie, and took numerous photographs. A few hours later, he took a hacksaw and severed Linda's left foot and stored it in a freezer, keeping Linda's encyclopedia as a souvenir. Then, he dumped her body somewhere in Marion County. Jan Susan Whitney, 23 years old, on November 26, 1968, her car broke down, so she had to stand on the side of the highway with her 3 friends and wait for help. Jerome was on his way home when he met the 4 young men. He kindly examined Whitney's car and claimed that he could fix it, but he asked the pretty young girl to come with him home to get the tools to fix the car. Whitney and her 3 friends agreed after a short discussion, and because of the long wait, 2 other friends chose to ride with Jerome because their homes were nearby and they wanted a ride. Jerome dropped the 2 off at their destination, and then he drove Whitney to his home, ostensibly to pick up the repair tools. But in reality, instead of doing that, he quietly went back to the back seat of the car because she was feeling so tired that she didn't notice exactly what Jerome was doing and put up little resistance before being strangled to death by Jerome with a leather luggage strap. He then carried her body to the garage where he sexually assaulted and humiliated her body. Most horrifically, Whitney was hung by him above the ceiling of the garage. And 2 days later, a car accidentally crashed into his garage. And then a police officer rushed to the scene and investigated the damage caused by the accident. But due to dust, debris, and the lack of lights, that police officer kept logging in outside of the garage while this victim's body was hanging from the ceiling inside the garage. Karen Elena Sprinker, an 18-year-old chemistry student at Oregon State University, had planned to go to lunch with her mother on the day of March 27, 1969, when she was abducted at gunpoint from the parking lot outside of the Mir and Frank department store by Jerome, who was dressed in a miniskirt and high heels and looking for a young woman dressed the same way as he was. Fortunately, he didn't find one, but unfortunately, Sprinker was abducted. According to Jerome, Sprinker kept begging him not to hurt her and said she'd do anything for him. Jerome then asked if she was a virgin, and she cried and said she was. She was on her period, and Jerome got so horny he forced the poor girl to take off her clothes and sexually assaulted her on the garage floor. Then, Sprinker was forced to pose in different lingerie and shoes for Jerome to take pictures. Nothing changed for Sprinker, even after she agreed to these demands. She was still bound by Jerome with her hands tied and a rope around her neck. After a few minutes, she, like Whitney, was suspended from the garage ceiling and died of asphyxiation. Over the next several hours, Jerome subjected her body to sexually degrading behavior and cut off her breasts. That night, Sprinker was dumped in the Willamette River. In April 1969, Jerome started acting more crazily and tried to kidnap 2 young women on back-to-back days. Luckily, both girls escaped and told the police about what happened. The first girl, Sharon Wood, a 24-year-old motorist, met Jerome on April 21st in an underground stairwell in a Portland parking garage. She said she felt a knocking motion on her shoulder, and when she turned around, all she saw was a man pointing a pistol at her face and ordering her not to scream. Wood bravely fought back, biting, kicking, and twisting his wrist to turn the gun away from her and toward him. She even bit his hand. This made Jerome angry, so he slammed her head on the concrete floor and ran away. The next day, 15-year-old schoolgirl Gloria Zhang Smith was forced at gunpoint to go with Jerome to a green Volkswagen. Jerome said, "I want you to come with me. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to rape you." And then he grabbed Smith by the jacket and forced her to walk with him. When Smith saw a woman working on the lawn, she yelled and ran toward the woman, which caused Jerome to panic and flee the scene. Linda Dawn Saleh, a 22-year-old moving company secretary and part-time student at Portland State University in Beaverton, Oregon, was kidnapped on the afternoon of April 23, 1969, in the parking lot of a shopping center. Saleh, who had just bought slacks and a watch band from the mall and was going to give them to her fiancé as a birthday present, was approached by Jerome, who showed her a fake police badge and told her that she was under arrest for shoplifting. He said he was a cop, and even though Saleh insisted she was innocent, she went with him to his car. There, Jerome threatened her and told her she had been kidnapped. He drove her to his house, where he made her follow him across the yard and into the basement. Just then, his wife came out to tell him that dinner was ready. Jerome told Saleh that he'd be back soon and took her back to the garage, where he tied her up with a rope. Jerome went inside alone to have dinner with his family. When he got back to the garage, after finishing dinner, he saw that Saleh had broken free and was trying to escape. He put a leash around her neck right away. Saleh asked him why he was treating her this way, then started to claw and kick him. But women are not as strong as men, so she was strangled to death while he was sexually assaulting her. Eventually, her body was tortured and studied, and a day later Saleh's body was dumped in the Willamette River. On May 10, 1969, two fishermen found the body of a bound, bloated young woman wearing a jacket and pinned down by a big gearbox in the shallow waters of the Longtom River. Because the woman's body was so badly decomposed, the autopsy couldn't confirm whether or not she had been sexually assaulted, but it did confirm that the cause of death was strangulation. The autopsy also found traces of burns on her body, which was later that woman as Sally. 2 days later, an underwater search and rescue team found Sprinker's body about 20 yards from where Sally's body had been found. The autopsy showed that she had died from suffocation and her breasts were missing. The main thing linking the deaths of Sally and Sprinker to the same killer was that both young women were bound by the same brand of hot plate and both were tied up with car parts. This suggests that the killer may have had a background as an electrician or mechanic. To figure out where the car parts came from, the police talked to employees and owners of all the garages and junkyards in Western Oregon. After officially identifying the two women, the investigators also talked to their family members and friends. The police investigation into Sprinker's relationships revealed that, in recent months, several of the female students had received calls from a man claiming to be a military veteran who asked to take them on dates, but almost all of them refused, except for one, who, in a state of some kind of sympathy, she let the man take her on a date, and after being interviewed by the police, she described him as a white man in his late 20s or early 30s with thinning blonde hair and freckles, and his car was a dirty station wagon. That date was pretty rough, and the girl was pretty cautious because she remembered the two victims found in the river. When she got home, the man asked why she'd changed her mind and agreed to go with him. She said she was just curious, and he said, "How do you know I won't take you to the river and strangle you?" The girl really didn't want to go on any more dates with him, but the police asked her to let them know if he ever asked her out again. She agreed, and a week later, he did ask her out. Then the police arrested him at the agreed-upon meeting spot. Jerome gave the police his real name, age, and job, but a false address. There wasn't a good reason to detain him, so he was quickly released. Even though a background check showed a history of physical and sexual violence against women, and a search of the vehicle database revealed that he lived in the Portland area where Linda was last seen alive, and after finding Brutos's real address, investigators found that a few blocks away from where he lived was the location of the department store where Sprinker was abducted. Also, while Jerome didn't own a Volkswagen, investigators found out that his mom did, and that he drove it on April 22nd, the day of Smith's attempted abduction. Smith said that Jerome was definitely the guy who tried to kidnap her. On May 26, the cops searched Jerome's place and found a ton of women's underwear and shoes in his garage, lists of phone numbers for sorority and sorority women's living spaces, and a bunch of Polaroid pics of young women, some alive and some dead. Almost all of the photos were taken inside his garage, and several of them showed a dead woman hanging from a garage pulley. There was a mirror on the floor next to her, and in one photo you could see him holding his Polaroid camera. One of them was identified as Sprinker, and she was depicted standing nude with her face showing a severe expression of fear, contemplation, or apparent submissiveness. She was also wearing high-heeled flip-flops. A female breast was found on the mantelpiece in the living room. Police also found a coil of copper wire, the same type used to tie Sally's and Sprinker's bodies to engine parts before dumping them in the Longtom River, in addition to a bunch of engine parts scattered around the garage. On May 29th, as the murder investigation went on, investigators had enough evidence to link Jerome to the attempted abduction of Smith to arrest him. And the next night he called his wife and asked her to destroy any more incriminating evidence, but his wife refused. After his second arrest, he was questioned about the evidence found in his garage and his relationship with the missing and murdered young women. Investigators had identified 3 of these women as Whitney, Sprinker, and Sally. Jerome initially denied any involvement in any of the cases, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial, but after a few days he began to gradually reveal his sexual fetishes and described how they were deeply ingrained in his psyche and daily life. By early June, Jerome had confessed to all 4 murders to the investigators and then described them to the police and psychologists. He started with Linda's murder, admitting that it was because of a pair of attractive high-heeled shoes the young woman was wearing when she accidentally came into his house to sell encyclopedias. Then he described each of his subsequent murders and attempted kidnappings in detail. Even though he admitted to being responsible for the murders, he didn't really give a full explanation of why he did it. He just said there must be something wrong with him. He said he didn't hate women, but he did kill them to deal with his emotions. On June 4th, Jerome was officially charged with the murders of Whitney, Sprinker, and Saleh. At his first court appearance, He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. After a bunch of doctors examined him, they all decided he was sane and could stand trial. Then, on June 27th, just 3 days before the trial was set to begin, he entered a formal plea of guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. This was done in front of a Marion County Circuit Court judge, and he was sentenced to 3 consecutive terms of life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole, to be served at the Oregon State Penitentiary. On August 7th, Schwindler was formally indicted for the first-degree murder of Springer, but these charges were based on the statement of an eyewitness who claimed to have seen Schwindler assisting Jerome in forcing a young woman under a blanket into their house on the day of Springer's disappearance. At the September trial, other witnesses refuted the eyewitness statement. The following month, Schwindler was found not guilty. After he was locked up, Jerome turned into a model inmate. In the 1970s, he was assigned clerical duties, using his electronic skills to maintain the prison's computerized record-keeping system and to install the cable television network. He was also trusted with the storage, repair, and maintenance of the prison's vending machines. As a convicted sex offender, he was physically assaulted a bunch of times by other inmates, all of whom he refused to name as his assailants. While he was in prison, Jerome went to a lot of parole hearings. His victims' families went to these hearings too, and they wanted him to stay in prison forever. On June 21, 1995, he found out that he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. Jerome died of liver cancer in the Oregon State Penitentiary on March 28, 2006, at 5:10 a.m. He was 67 years old. He was the longest incarcerated inmate in the Oregon Department of Corrections, having served a total of nearly 37 years. When someone heard about Jerome's death, a family member of one of the victims spoke about how she felt. She said, "As soon as I heard he died, I started crying. It wasn't for him. It was for our family. He put our family through hell." In 20th century London, on a quiet street, there stood a seemingly ordinary house. In 1953, while installing equipment in the kitchen wall, a tenant accidentally tore the wallpaper and uncovered a terrifying secret: 3 women's remains curled in the wall space, wrapped in cloth. This discovery rippled through the community like a stone thrown into still water. Police quickly arrived and expanded their search from the kitchen to the entire house. Beneath floorboards and in the backyard soil, they found more victims. The killer was the house's former tenant, John Reginald Halliday Christie. Neighbors described him as mild-mannered and humble, claiming medical knowledge. Yet behind this ordinary appearance hid a cold, cunning, and twisted mind. Christie exploited people's trust and vulnerability, luring women to his home with promises of illegal abortions or other help. He would render them unconscious with gas before strangling them. Shockingly, his crimes extended beyond strangers. He murdered his own wife. Most disturbingly, he framed an innocent tenant for some murders, leading to the wrong man's execution. On April 8, 1899, a couple living near Halifax, West Yorkshire, welcomed their 6th child out of 7, Christie. He had 5 older sisters and 1 younger brother. His childhood was unhappy. Though his father worked as a carpet designer and stayed home often, Christie had a terrible relationship with him. His father was a very strict man who never opened up to family, showed little emotion, and harshly punished minor mistakes. Christie's mother seemed to spoil him but allowed his sisters to bully him. This complicated family environment deeply shaped his personality. On March 24, 1911, Christie's 75-year-old grandfather died at home after long illness. Christie felt no sadness or fear. Instead, seeing his grandfather's body, perhaps due to enduring years of bullying, he felt revenge and happiness. The once intimidating, bad-tempered man now lay still as a cold body on the funeral table, powerless to hurt him anymore. As a teenager, others described Christie as strange. Though he earned a Halifax secondary school scholarship for good grades, he remained solitary and unpopular. Even when singing in church choirs or joining the Boy Scouts later, nobody befriended him. His extreme quietness suggested bottled-up emotions. At 14, he left school and took his first job as a trainee cinema projectionist. Christie struggled with a deeply troubling issue throughout his life. During a date with a girl, he failed to perform sexually, not due to her refusal, but because of erectile dysfunction. Though physically normal, psychological barriers likely caused by years of neglect and bullying from his mother and sisters prevented intimacy. After this incident, he stopped dating and earned cruel nicknames, Reggie No Dick and Cannot Do It Christie. So then he began seeking nighttime street prostitutes for physical needs instead. In September 1916, during World War I, Christie joined the 52nd Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire Regiment as infantry. A year later in France, he transferred to the Duke of Wellington's regiment as signalman. That June, a mustard gas attack injured him. Hospitalized for a month, he later claimed it caused 3.5 years of blindness, muteness, and permanently affected his voice. However, military records showed no eye-throat damage. His hoarse voice possibly stemmed from psychological issues or histrionic personality traits, exaggerating injuries for sympathy. On May 10, 1920, despite ongoing erectile issues, Christie married Ethel Simpson from Bradford at Halifax Register Office, using money stolen from a church collection box. After their marriage, he worked as a letter carrier in the post office. However, he worked hard just to go out on the streets at nighttime, looking for sex workers, something Simpson was well aware of. So, after separating from her husband, she moved to Yorkshire to live with her siblings. Christie frequently stole and sold stamps until his crimes were discovered on April 12, 1921, resulting in a 3-month prison sentence. After release, he remained unchanged. Within months, he received a 1-year sentence for fraud and violent behavior. With his reputation ruined locally, he left Simpson and moved alone to London. But crime remained Christie's first choice for survival. In 1924, he committed 2 thefts, receiving 3-month and 6-month sentences respectively. Later, he became a truck driver, but his violent temper caused dangerous driving. He would chase and verbally attack anyone overtaking him. Within 2 years, Christie received another 6-month sentence for assaulting a pedestrian. He had beaten the victim's head with a cricket bat so severely that prosecutors called it attempted murder. In 1934, he was released from prison, but this time he was arrested for stealing a car, and after his release, he stopped committing crimes, a request made by his wife to stop committing crimes before she would consider reconnecting with him. In 1937, the couple moved into 10 Rillington Street in the London borough of Notting Hill, a dilapidated apartment built in 1870, where the whole building needed to share an outdoor toilet. In 1939, Christie falsified his resume to blend in with the War Reserve Police. At that time, he used his position to seduce Gladys Jones, a colleague in the police department, and started an affair with her. In fact, this woman had a husband who was also an active military man. In 1943, after coming back from the war, when her husband learned that his wife was having a sexual relationship with Christie, and they often stayed together, he was so enraged that he rushed to the house where Jones lived, found Christie, and beat him severely. Another decade followed, the last of which saw him commit multiple burglaries, and this one, from 1943 to 1953, saw him embark on a career of murder. 21-year-old Austrian worker Ruth Forrest was in dire straits and would often subsidize her household by engaging in sex work. She had long been soliciting clients for sex work in a snack bar in Ladbroke Grove, London, and on that occasion she met Christie, a seemingly refined man, who asked Forrest to come to his house for sexual services, because his wife had gone home to visit her relatives. Forced to come to his home for sexual services, the young girl agreed. However, this trip was never heard from again, because after having sex, Christie directly strangled her with a rope on the bed. Then he stored Forrest's body under the floor of the living room, but due to the fear that the smell emitted from the body will be smelled, so the next day, he buried the Forrest's body was buried in the back garden. Shortly after the murder, Christie resigned from his job as a reserve police officer, and then he found a job as a clerk in a factory, where he met his second victim, a female colleague, 32-year-old Muriel Amelia Eady, who had suffered from bronchitis for a long time. And on October 7, 1944, Christie invited her to come with him to his apartment. To go to his apartment with him, where he told her that he had made a special mixture that would cure her bronchitis, which was, in fact, only a friar's balsam that masked the odor. But unbeknownst to her, she continued to inhale gas from a pipe connected to the gas tap until she passed out from gas poisoning. And then Christie sexually assaulted and strangled her, burying both her body and that of his first victim in the back garden. During Easter 1948, Timothy Evans and his wife Beryl moved into the dilapidated apartment. That October, Beryl gave birth to their daughter Geraldine there. In late 1949, Timothy suddenly reported his wife's death to police. Initial searches found nothing, but later investigations revealed 3 bodies in the outdoor washhouse: Beryl, Geraldine, and a 16-week male fetus. Beryl's body was wrapped in blankets and tablecloths. Autopsy reports showed both mother and daughter had been strangled, with Beryl sustaining facial bruises from physical assault before death. Timothy claimed Christie killed his wife during a botched abortion, but after police interrogation, he unexpectedly confessed to murder, though his statement contained suspicious elements suggesting possible fabrication, but this didn't affect the case outcome. On January 11, 1950, Timothy was tried for the murder of his daughter, Geraldine. The police did not pursue him for the murder of his wife. At that time, Christie appeared before the police as a suspect accused by Timothy and became the police's main witness. He first denied Timothy's accusations against him and then gave detailed evidence about Timothy and Beryl having an altercation. Despite counsel providing information about Christie's record of burglary and violent crimes, arguing that he should not have been a witness, the jury found Timothy guilty. After he was sentenced to be hanged, he appealed and once again lost, and he was eventually executed by hanging on March 9, 1950, at Pentonville Crown Prison. The police made multiple serious mistakes in their handling of this case, and these mistakes ultimately led to Timothy's wrongful death. Firstly, they failed to carry out a thorough and careful search of the crime scene. It was later discovered that one of the victim's femurs was even supporting the fence in the back garden. The item was very small, yet they did not excavate it during their search. Christie later admitted that shortly after the police search, his dog found Edie's skull in the garden. Had they carried out a thorough search, he would definitely have been arrested earlier before he could go ahead with further killings. In addition, the police mishandled Timothy's interrogation. When he was shown his wife's and baby's clothes, they informed him straight away that they had been found in the laundry. This was information that should have been withheld to force him to disclose where the bodies were hidden. His confession also contained a number of dubious words and phrases that seemed too high-flown for an uneducated, working-class young man like him, which may well have been fabricated. Without much scrutiny, the police readily accepted all of Christie's statements and used him as a key witness. Although Christie had been a reserve police officer, they took him completely at his word, accepting his statements at face value and not carrying out any further investigations into the veracity of his words. They also overlooked the fact that Christie had a criminal record for burglary and malicious wounding, while Timothy had no prior violent offenses. Post-trial, Christie's life returns to normal and he finds a job as a clerk with British Road Services. Meanwhile, the new tenants of the apartment are mostly immigrants from the West Indies. Christie and his wife have strong racist prejudices against these new neighbors and do not like to live with them. Christie's wife prosecutes one of the neighbors for assault, and tensions between the two sides escalate further. Christie then negotiates with the Lawyers' Center to enable him to continue to have exclusive use of the back garden, ostensibly to distance himself from his neighbors, but more likely to prevent anyone from discovering the human remains buried in the garden. On December 6, 1952, Christie quit his job and began selling household items to survive. 8 days later, he strangled his wife in bed. Her last public sighting had been 2 days prior. To hide her disappearance, he invented multiple stories, telling Sheffield relatives she had rheumatism preventing letter writing, informing one neighbor she visited Sheffield relatives, and telling another she went to Birmingham. On December 17th, he sold Simpson's wedding ring and watch. By January 8, 1953, he sold furniture while collecting unemployment benefits. On January 26th, he forged her signature to empty her bank account. By February 27th, he'd sold her clothing. Between January 19th and March 6th, Christie murdered 3 women, Kathleen Maloney, Rita Nelson, and Hectorina McLennan. Kathleen was a sex worker from the Ladbroke Grove area. Nelson was from Belfast and was Ladbroke Grove visiting her sister and was also 6 months pregnant, and McLennan was living in a cafe in London. He met these women repeatedly to build trust before luring them to his flat. Upgrading his gas method, he now used rubber tubing connected to the kitchen gas pipe, sealed with a bulldog clip. After seating victims in the kitchen, he'd release the clip to flood the room with gas. When unconscious, he strangled them with rope. After killing, he placed vests or cloth between their legs, wrapped their half-naked bodies in blankets, then concealed them in a kitchen wall cavity later covered with wallpaper. On March 20th, Christie fraudulently sublet his room to a couple. When the landlord visited that evening and found them instead of Christie, he ordered them to leave by next day. The landlord then allowed another tenant to use Christie's kitchen. On March 24th, while installing a radio bracket on the kitchen wall, This tenant accidentally discovered 3 bodies hidden behind wall panels. Confirming they were human remains, he immediately alerted police, triggering a citywide manhunt. After fleeing the flat, Christie booked a 7-day stay at Roten House in King's Cross using his real name and address. He stayed only 4 days, hastily departing on March 24th upon learning of the body discovery. He wandered the streets afterward, spending days in cafes, cinemas, sleeping rough at night. On March 31st morning, officers arrested him near Putney Bridge Embankment. A search revealed an old newspaper clipping about Timothy's remand hearing. During interrogation, Christie initially admitted only to the kitchen wall murders and his wife's killing. When shown garden skeletons, he confessed those too. On April 27th, he admitted murdering Beryl Evans, though persistently denied killing her daughter Geraldine. However, his conversation hinted possible involvement. Experts speculate he avoided confessing Geraldine's murder to plead insanity at trial, fearing jury hatred and prisoner retaliation if convicted. On June 5th, he confessed to Edie and Forrest's murders, helping police identify their remains. Ultimately, he stood trial only for his wife's murder. Proceedings began June 22nd at the same court where Timothy had been tried 3 years prior. Christie repeatedly claimed insanity during trial, with his lawyer arguing he was mad with fragmented memories. Then, a Brixton prison doctor assessed Christie as a prosecution witness. Using contemporary medical terms, he testified Christie had hysterical personality but wasn't legally insane. Then the jury rejected his insanity plea, convicting him after 85 minutes deliberation, and the judge sentenced Christie to death. On June 29th, Christie declared he wouldn't appeal his conviction. On July 2nd, Timothy's mother wrote to him demanding full confession to prove her son's innocence. A member of Parliament spent 45 minutes speaking with Christie on July 8th. The next day, he underwent murder case questioning. By July 12th, the Home Secretary found no medical or psychological grounds to grant reprieve. Christie's final visitors in the death cell included former army friends, the prison governor, and his sister, who all saw him the night before execution. Witnesses described him as resigned to his fate. At 9 a.m. on July 15, 1953, Christie was hanged at HMP Pentonville by the same executioner who had killed Timothy. As the noose was placed, Christie complained about an itchy nose. The hangman replied, "It won't trouble you for long." His body was buried in an unmarked grave within prison grounds, standard British practice for executed prisoners. Herbert Richard Baumeister, behind his identity as a businessman, also hides the dark side of an unconvicted American serial killer. His violent, antisocial behavior and multiple personality disorder cast a shadow over his mental world. As a bisexual man, he has a wonderful family and a thoughtful wife who chooses to remain steadfastly by his side even though he suffers from schizophrenia. However, in unseen moments, he frequented gay bars, not only for the thrill of it, but also to pick out some victims to target for his murders. He would lure those victims to his home under various pretexts, then drug them with alcohol and take them to the basement of the house when they passed out. There, he used various brutal means to end their lives. After the incident, the police found video cameras in his house, which made it seem like he recorded the murders and watched them over and over again in the dead of night, or even sold them to other evil people. On top of that, the police thought he might have killed more than a dozen other people in the rural area between Indiana and Ohio along Interstate 70. But after he killed himself, all the clues disappeared like smoke, leaving only an endless mystery and mourning for those innocent lives. On April 7, 1947, an anesthesiologist and his wife had their first kid, Herbert, in an Indianapolis hospital. His childhood isn't documented a lot, but he shouldn't be described as if he had a normal, peaceful life. For one thing, he lived in an area that was very chaotic, had frequent violent crime, and as we all know, it's basically impossible for a child who grows up the usual way to act antisocially when they reach puberty. As a teenager, Herbert did a bunch of shocking things. There were reports that his classmates found out about his interest in dead animals, and on one occasion, he even snuck a dead crow onto his teacher's desk. On top of that, one of the things he would often ponder on was his desire to experience what it would be like to taste human urine. There were also rumors that he showed very strong disruptive tendencies, not just disrupting the classroom, but also urinating on the teacher's desk. So his parents got a call from the school, and then his dad took him to see a bunch of psychiatrists. During that time, he did a bunch of psychiatric evaluations and was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Some of the psychiatrists thought he might have multiple personality disorder, but he didn't get any more treatment, which is weird because people with schizophrenia have a distorted idea of reality. They have delusions and hallucinations and disorganized behaviors, and they need lifelong therapy to control themselves. Because of all this, in high school he was virtually, and no one wanted to touch him. Herbert enrolled at Indiana University in 1965, but dropped out after just one semester because of a mental health issue. In 1967, he returned to Indiana University, this time with his father's support, and studied anatomy. There, he also met his future wife, Juliana Sater, who was a part-time student and also held a career as a high school journalism teacher. They had the same interests and really conservative political views, so they started dating. They later got married in November 1971, but 6 months later, his dad sent him to the loony bin for 2 months because he had another psychotic break. Juliana said her husband was hurting inside and he needed help and companionship, so she'd always be there for him. They had 3 kids together, and Juliana later said that in more than 25 years of marriage, they'd only had sex 6 times, and she'd never seen Herbert naked. After graduating, Herbert did a bunch of odd jobs, and he still acted very strangely. At the time, he got a job with the Indiana Department of Motor Vehicles. His coworkers there called him eccentric, arrogant, and aggressive, and he was known to sarcastically greet other staff members. One year, he sent his coworkers a Christmas card with a picture of him and another man, both dressed in holiday attire, so they whispered behind his back that he was a lunatic and a closet homosexual. But despite all that office gossip, he was promoted to become the program director. Unfortunately, his mental health issues got the better of him, and he was fired from his job after peeing in a letter to the governor of Indiana. In 1985, Herbert became a father of 3 young children, and Juliana became a full-time mom. But when he was fired from the Department of Motor Vehicles, Juliana returned to her job, and he took over the care of the home and children. In September, Herbert was caught drunk driving by the police, and 6 months later he was charged with stealing a friend's car and conspiracy to commit larceny. But because he suffered from mental illness, he went unpunished, and in the meantime he frequented a number of gay bars. In some time, he got a job at a thrift store, and he realized that this way of running a store had the potential to make money. While working there, he studied how it was done and imitated it, until, in 1988, he took a $4,000 loan from his mother and opened his own thrift store. By the time the first store started making a lot of money, Herbert gave some of the profits to a local charity, the Children's Bureau of Indianapolis. And then, pretending to work with the charity, he made more money and splurged on an 18-acre mansion called Fox Hollow Farms, which had an indoor swimming pool, and also opened a second thrift store. Herbert's murder case is so complex that it requires a 2-part narrative. The first part involves a serial killer who committed a number of murders on Interstate 70 in Indiana and Ohio between 1980 and 1991. These murders are collectively known as the I-70 Strangler cases. Michael Sean Petrie, a 15-year-old who worked as a prostitute, was reported missing on June 7, 1980. He had been hanging out in gay bars for a lot of his life, and 3 days later, witnesses said they saw him leaving in someone else's car in another part of town. 6 days later, his body was found on the outskirts of Hamilton County, Indiana. An autopsy revealed that the cause of death was confirmed as strangulation, and that no drugs or alcohol were detected in his blood. This suggests that he most likely died a slow death in a fully conscious state. Morris Allan Taylor, 22-year-old, a homeless man living in the boiler room of an Indianapolis apartment building who, due to financial difficulties, offered sex outside of surrounding gay bars, was found on July 21, 1982, his half-naked body in Weasel Creek in rural Hamilton County, Indiana. His body remained unidentified for 8 months after its discovery because his mother was hospitalized for mental health issues at the time of his disappearance. Delvoyd Lee Baker, 14-year-old, who had been offering sex at gay bars for $20 to $23 a night for the 3 months prior to his death, was found half-naked on October 3, 1982, near a river in Hamilton County, Indiana. As police investigated his death, his parents revealed that he had ridden his bike downtown the night he disappeared and called home at 10:30 p.m., telling them he would be home late because he planned to go to the movies. One witness said that on the night of October 2nd, he got into a blue van driven by a young white man with a thick beard. Michael Andrew Riley, 22-year-old, disappeared without a trace on May 28, 1983, after a night out. 8 days later, his body was found in a ditch in Hancock County, southeast of Greenfield. A witness said he'd been with an unidentified man and left the nightclub with him. 15 years later, a local resident contacted the police, claiming Herbert was the man. Eric Allan Rotker, 17-year-old, was reported missing on May 7, 1985, and his parents said he was supposed to go to interviews for summer jobs that day, but he didn't show up to any. One witness said they saw him at a bus stop early that morning, but instead of waiting for a bus, he got into a car that passed by. A few days later, his half-naked body was found near a stream in rural Preble County, east of Lewisburg, Ohio. An autopsy revealed burn marks on his left shoulder, and the cause of death was strangulation. Michael Allen Glenn, 29-year-old, lived apart from his parents. He lived alone in a trailer park in suburban Indianapolis and worked odd jobs every day to make ends meet. His body was found in a ditch near Eaton, Ohio, on August 15, 1986. He was wearing only a pair of underpants, and the cause of death was also strangulation. However, due to technological limitations, his identity was not confirmed until several years later through fingerprint matching. James Boyd Robbins Jr., 21-year-old, went missing around 10 p.m. on October 15, 1987, after leaving his mom's place and heading out on the road. 2 days later, his half-naked body was found in a ditch in rural Shelby County. During the investigation, 2 witnesses gave conflicting information. One said he saw a red Jeep Wrangler Renegade near the scene of the crime, while the other said it was a Chevrolet Blazer. In May 1989, Jean Paul Talbot's body was found near a stream in Defiance County, Ohio, and like the other victims, the cause of death was strangulation. Stephen Lynn Elliott, 26-year-old, who left his home and started working as a sex worker in 1979 after coming out as gay and getting hooked on booze, was found half-naked in the countryside near Interstate 70 in Preble County on August 12, 1989, and his cause of death was strangulation. On August 14, 1990, Clay Russell Boatman, a 32-year-old nurse practitioner, disappeared after leaving his apartment to go to a local gay bar. His body was found in a ditch near Eaton, Ohio, by a group of kids. In interviews with the media, his family denied that he was gay. Thomas Ray Clevenger Jr. grew up in an impoverished neighborhood and relied on providing sex in local gay bars to earn a living. On September 6, 1990, at the age of 18, he mysteriously disappeared. His half-naked body was later found on an abandoned railroad track near Greenville, Ohio. After his death, his family denied his status as a sex worker and refused to accept the results of the police investigation. On August 6, 1991, the body of Otto Gary Becker, a 42-year-old nurse practitioner, was found in a ditch next to a gravel road in rural Henry County, Indiana. While investigating his murder, police identified several witnesses who claimed to have seen him and another male traveling north on Interstate 70 near Indianapolis. When the witnesses were brought to the police station, the police showed them pictures of various criminals convicted of kidnapping and murder in the state, but none of them looked like the alleged kidnapper, who was also the last victim on Interstate 70. A lot of people who know about the case say that because Herbert bought the mansion at Fox Hollow Farm, his murders were moved there. So the rest of the story is all about the mansion. In 1994, Herbert's son was playing in the backyard when he found a complete, partially buried human skeleton. He told his mom about it, and Herbert said it was his father's, an anesthesiologist, doing some dissection during a study. He then said he found it while cleaning out the garage and decided to bury it there. Meanwhile, a detective named Virgil Vandegrift shows up. He used to be a sheriff's deputy, but after he retired, he opened a private investigation clinic that focused on missing persons cases. In June 1994, the mother of 28-year-old Alan Broussard contacted Virgil, and she asked him to look into her son's disappearance. Since her son was gay, the police didn't take the case seriously, so she had to come to Virgil. She said that her son had been on his way to a gay bar the night he disappeared, but that she had questioned the bar's management and that her son had not been there. A week later, Virgil was approached by another client whose son had also disappeared. The client was a 32-year-old gay man named Roger Goodlett, who had also disappeared after going to a gay bar. Since the two cases were so similar, both in terms of age, looks, sexual orientation, and basically how they disappeared, Virgil decided to work on both cases at the same time. He first contacted Roger and Alan's friends, co-workers, and people who frequented the gay bar, and then distributed posters with Roger and Alan's pictures on them. A few days later, someone said they'd seen Roger get into a blue car with Ohio license plates the night he disappeared. Meanwhile, the publisher of a gay magazine contacted Virgil to tell him about the serial murders on Interstate 70 that the police were investigating because the victims were gay. So Virgil figured these weren't just any disappearances, but a serial murder. So he tried to get the police department to take Roger and Allan's disappearance seriously. But everyone was pretty negative about homosexuality, and the police officers weren't any better. They weren't into investigating cases in the gay community. So Virgil's investigation was stuck until one of Roger's friends got in touch with him. This guy, Tony, said he was sure he'd seen the guy responsible for Roger's disappearance that night. He went to the police and the FBI, but they didn't take him seriously. That's why he found Virgil. He says he met a strange guy at a gay club that night, and the guy didn't talk to anyone else or drink, but he kept looking at a poster with Roger's picture on it. He thinks this guy could have something to do with Roger's disappearance, so he goes over and introduces himself and has a conversation. The man says his name is Brian Smart, a landscaper who's in Ohio working on a garden for a local mansion. Tony asks him if he knows Roger, but Smart says no. He's just curious about the poster. As the late night went on, Smart said that the house he was working on was huge and had a swimming pool where he currently lived. Since the owner wasn't home, he invited Tony to hang out there, saying they could use the pool and do some fun things. Tony agreed to the invitation, and then Smart took him to the mansion in a Buick with Ohio license plates. Virgil asked what part of the country the house was in, but Tony explained that he wasn't sure exactly where the house was because he didn't know the area very well. He just remembered the car driving around for a long time, and that it was a suburb that seemed to be in a pasture, and that there was a wooden sign hanging at the entrance with a couple of words on it, and one of them was farm. Tony said they went in through the side door, and he was shocked to see trash all over the place, like an abandoned house that hadn't been cleaned. Then they went to the pool area, which was weird and had a bunch of mannequins, like it was set up for a party, which was creepy. Smart seemed to know the place well, though. He went straight to the liquor cabinet and got Tony a drink, but Tony said he wasn't feeling it, so said no. Then the vibe got pretty awkward. Smart made an excuse to leave, but came back 10 minutes later. He got all worked up, acting like he'd been doing something shady, and started flirting with Tony in a weird way, talking about some kind of masturbation move called autoerotic asphyxiation. Tony grabbed a hose and started strangling Smart like he asked, even as he masturbated, which looked like he was enjoying it. When he was done, Smart said it was his turn. Tony wasn't interested, but when Smart was using the hose to strangle him, he realized that Smart was using so much force that it looked like he was trying to strangle him. So Tony pretended to faint and said he wanted to see what Smart was trying to do. When Smart saw Tony in a coma, he looked pretty freaked out, dropped the hose, and started searching for something. Tony, realizing something was off, faked waking up because he was afraid that if he waited until Smart got a knife, he'd actually be killed. When Smart saw that Tony was awake, he got a panicked look on his face and claimed he didn't mean to do that. Tony didn't say anything and just asked Smart to take him home. Before they went their separate ways, Smart also asked to meet Tony the following week. When he finished the story, he told Virgil he was scared. Virgil thought about it for a while. He then said that Smart's actions did seem like he was trying to kill him just because he was so big. And the drink could have had a hypnotic drug in it, so if he had drank it, he could have been strangled for real. Virgil was starting to think Smart was up to something, so he asked Tony to keep the date going with Smart while he got some people to watch over Tony, but Smart never showed up again until it was time for the date to start. The investigation has hit a wall, so Virgil goes back to the local police for help. This time, he finds Mary Wilson, a detective who's been working with missing persons for years. They'd worked together for ages, so they knew each other pretty well. Mary drove Tony right away, and they wandered around the neighborhood trying to find the house from that night. But even though a whole year had passed, Virgil and Mary hadn't been able to find the house that Tony had described, and they weren't even close to finding any sign of Roger and Allan. It wasn't until August 1995 that Tony gave them a new lead when he contacted Virgil and claimed that he had seen Smart again and had taken down his license plate number. Then, after Mary got the plate number, she checked the police database and found that it belonged to a local businessman named Herbert. So she started investigating him. The more she looked into him, the more she and Virgil agreed that he was the killer because he had a bunch of mental illnesses and antisocial behaviors, which are exactly what expect from a serial killer. So Mary and Virgil head to Herbert's thrift store and try to get him to let them search his place, but he refuses and tells them to go talk to his lawyer. But they're not about to give up. Instead, they find Juliana and try to get her to help them. However, Juliana, who's still in love with her husband at this point, is convinced that Herbert can't be a criminal, so she also refuses their request. Rebuffed, Mary has to go to the police department to obtain a search warrant, but she is again rebuffed because she has too little evidence to prove Herbert is a killer at all, and because Herbert has a good reputation in the area for working with charities on a regular basis. But time is on Mary's side, and since Herbert opened his second thrift store, his business has become dismal, and charities have ended their work with him. His mental illness has also once again spiraled out of control. His behavior has become erratic. He treats Juliana like a subordinate and often yells at her for no apparent reason. To escape, Juliana has to spend weekends with her children at her mother-in-law's apartment, and she was contemplating getting a lawyer to file for a divorce from Herbert. At this point, Mary once again approaches Juliana for permission to search, and Juliana is reminded of the human skeleton her son found in the grove in 1994, so she grants Mary's request to search. On June 24, 1996, with Juliana's permission, Mary entered the house at Fox Hollow Farm with 3 Hamilton County police officers, who walked around on the garden where the skeleton had been found earlier, and then found what looked like white pebbles in a patch of grass. And apparently, with a good eye, they decided that it was definitely not rocks, but more like bones. A few days later, after a forensic examination, those bones were human bones, so the police sent more investigators to continue the search around the house, and they searched the garden, and eventually found almost 10,000 human bones, which, according to estimates at the time, were the remains of 11 victims. Juliana, as you can imagine, went through a lot. Part of the reason she was able to give her consent to the police to launch a search was because her husband was visiting his mother with their children. But it turned out that the police literally dug up the victims' bones in the house, which meant that the safety of her children was out of control. And she wasn't sure that her husband had seen the news on the television because by this time their home had made local news headlines. But Herbert didn't show up, her kids were safe, and he was the only one who disappeared. On July 3rd, a week after Juliana let the police into the house and search it, police in Ontario, Canada, found Herbert's body. He had shot himself, and he left a 3-page suicide note. In the note, he didn't say whether he'd been involved in the murder or not. Instead, he explained that he had chosen to kill himself because of the failure of his marriage and business, and not because of the revelation of his murderous crimes. The victims located at Fox Hollow Farm have not been fully identified to this day. When the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department called for people to come in and take the DNA test to help identify the victims. But it was known that homosexuality was not recognized in those days. So, as of January 2024, forensic examiners are also still struggling to identify some of the victims, especially since by 2022, the police had discovered more suspected burial sites for the victims. Herbert, the culprit, chose to take his own life, but there was also no mention at all in his suicide note of the murders he committed, so the full story is not clear to anyone.